Get your hands off my jacket, or I will have local law enforcement drag you out of this lobby in handcuffs for trespassing. Do you understand me, old man?" The words echoed like a violent gunshot through the cavernous vaulted ceilings of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. The grand lobby, usually a heavily guarded sanctuary of hushed voices, classical piano music, and clinking crystal champagne flutes, instantly fell into a suffocating, terrified silence. Bradley Preston, the general manager of the estate, stood with his chest aggressively puffed out beneath a perfectly tailored midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo. His face was deeply flushed with a toxic, volatile cocktail of absolute arrogance and unchecked rage. His freshly manicured finger jabbed violently through the cold air, stopping mere millimeters from the chest of a 70-year-old man. That man was Marcus. Marcus stood entirely still. He was a dignified, quietly powerful elder, his posture remaining unbroken despite the two massive earpiece-wearing private security guards flanking his sides. The guards' heavy, aggressive hands were already gripping the fragile shoulders of Marcus's neatly pressed, though undeniably decades-old Sunday suit. The charcoal fabric of Marcus's suit was worn thin at the elbows from years of grueling, honest labor, creating a stark, unavoidable visual contrast to the aggressive opulence and sickening wealth surrounding him. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the ceiling cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene, illuminating the ugly racial and class divide actively playing out on the imported Italian marble floor. Bradley sneered, his incredibly expensive designer cologne completely failing to mask the pungent ugliness of his hostility. He looked at Marcus not as a human being, not as a father or a citizen, but as a literal stain on his pristine, exclusive establishment. Marcus did not flinch in the face of this vitriol. He did not raise his voice to match the frantic energy of the manager. He simply looked back at Bradley with a deep, stoic sorrow radiating the kind of quiet resilience that is only forged through a lifetime of navigating a world that constantly demanded he prove his basic right to exist. The wealthy, predominantly white patrons scattered throughout the lobby abruptly stopped in their tracks. Women draped in diamond chokers, and men wrapped in bespoke European suits whispered behind their manicured hands, their eyes darting toward Marcus with unmistakable disdain, silently endorsing the general manager's public cruelty. The tension was a physical weight in the room, heavy and suffocating, waiting for a breaking point. Have you ever stood helplessly by and watched someone completely disrespect the man who raised you, the man who sacrificed absolutely everything, simply because they looked at his skin and his worn-in shoes and immediately assumed he was a nobody? 45 minutes earlier, the reality of the evening had felt entirely different. The atmosphere inside the modest, rented mid-size vehicle was incredibly warm, heavily insulated from the freezing elements outside, filled with the soft hum of the heater and the quiet, comforting rhythm of familiar jazz playing through the stereo system. Maya Sterling sat relaxed behind the steering wheel, her sharp eyes focused on the rain-slicked roads leading toward the city's most elite, heavily gated district. To anyone looking through the windshield from the sidewalk, Maya appeared remarkably unremarkable. She wore a faded, oversized gray Howard University hoodie that swallowed her frame, paired with simple black athletic leggings and mud-splattered running shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a quick, highly practical bun. There was absolutely nothing about her casual outward appearance that signaled she was the ruthless, self-made private equity billionaire who had recently dominated the cover of the world's most prestigious financial magazines. That was exactly how she preferred to operate. She had mastered the devastating art of silent wealth. The only tangible hint of her true socioeconomic status was securely tucked away in the back seat, hidden inside a heavy, opaque garment bag holding a custom $50,000 couture gown specifically tailored for the evening's festivities. Beside her in the passenger seat sat her father, Marcus. He was nervously yet proudly smoothing the lapels of his suit, his heavily calloused hands moving with a gentle reverence over the old fabric. Tonight was the highly anticipated Hawthorne Heritage Gala, the absolute most exclusive high society event of the decade, a closed-door gathering of the city's political titans and financial elite. Marcus held a thick, heavy gold-foiled V1P invitation securely in his inner breast pocket. He had been talking about this specific night for 3 straight weeks to anyone who would listen. For a man who had spent 40 agonizing years working grueling double shifts at the Municipal Transit Authority just to make sure his brilliant daughter could afford her college textbooks, receiving a personalized invitation to sit among the city's most powerful figures was a profound, life-altering validation. It was a physical symbol that his lifelong sacrifices had truly meant something, that his family had finally arrived in the very rooms where they were historically denied entry. Maya glanced over at him, a soft, deeply affectionate smile breaking her usually intensely focused corporate expression. She saw the pure pride radiating from him mixed with the undeniable, deep-seated anxiety of stepping into an environment structurally designed to keep people exactly like him out. She knew exactly what kind of systemic gatekeeping existed at the Hawthorne Heritage Club, which was precisely why her firm had been silently acquiring their debt for the past 6 months. She pulled the vehicle up to the grand sweeping driveway of the club's majestic entrance, purposefully stopping just short of the intimidating valet line. The harsh winter wind was howling violently outside, sending sharp gusts of freezing rain against the windshield glass. Maya put the vehicle in park and turned completely to her father. She told him firmly that she did not want him walking 3 agonizing blocks from the public parking garage in this freezing weather, knowing how deeply the cold affected his bad knees. She explicitly instructed him to go inside the warm building, hand his VIP invitation directly to the front concierge, and get comfortable by the lobby fireplace. She promised she would go, park the rental, take a brief but highly critical corporate conference call regarding an international hostile takeover change into her formal gown, and meet him by the grand staircase in exactly 20 minutes. Marcus hesitated, his dark eyes nervously scanning the intimidating towering stone columns and the massive brass doors of the country club. He asked if she was absolutely sure it was all right for him to walk in there alone. Maya reached out and squeezed his shoulder with an ironclad reassurance. She told him he was an honored guest and that he belonged in that room just as much, if not more, than anyone else breathing the air inside. With a final, incredibly proud nod, Marcus opened the heavy door and stepped out into the freezing night, completely unaware of the visceral hostility waiting for him, just beyond those gilded doors, and equally unaware of the devastating financial and legal apocalypse his billionaire daughter was fully prepared to unleash upon anyone who dared to compromise his dignity. Let us freeze this exact moment in time and look closely at the devastating humiliation painting this grand lobby. Have you ever stood completely paralyzed in a heavily populated public space and watched someone you love with your entire soul be brutally stripped of their basic human dignity? Have you ever felt that intense burning sensation tightening your chest when an arrogant stranger looks at the man who sacrificed his entire life to raise you and immediately dismisses him as completely worthless simply because of the color of his skin and the frayed edges of his collar? Think deeply about a time you witnessed blatant racial profiling completely masked as standard corporate protocol. Have you ever desperately wished you possessed the absolute financial power and undeniable legal authority to instantly crush the systemic prejudice standing right in front of you without saying a single word? Hold on to that visceral feeling of helpless rage and absolute injustice, because tonight that deeply entrenched power dynamic is about to be violently and permanently dismantled. Exactly 45 minutes before this catastrophic collision of socioeconomic classes, the reality of the evening had felt entirely different and deeply hopeful. The atmosphere inside the heavily tinted rented mid-size utility vehicle was incredibly warm and perfectly insulated from the freezing, brutal elements outside. The cabin was filled with the soft, ambient hum of the advanced climate control system, and the quiet, comforting rhythm of familiar classic jazz playing through the premium audio speakers. Maya Sterling sat completely relaxed behind the steering wheel with her sharp, calculating eyes, focused entirely on the rain-slicked roads leading toward the city's most elite and heavily guarded residential district. To any casual observer looking through the reinforced windshield from the wet sidewalk, Maya appeared remarkably unremarkable and entirely ordinary. She wore a faded, oversized gray Howard University hooded sweatshirt that completely swallowed her athletic frame, paired with simple black athletic leggings and mud-splattered running shoes. Her dark, natural hair was pulled back tightly into a quick, highly practical bun at the nape of her neck. There was absolutely nothing about her casual, outward appearance that signaled she was the ruthless, self-made private equity billionaire who had recently dominated the cover of the world's most prestigious global financial magazines. That was exactly how she preferred to strategically operate in a world violently obsessed with loud, superficial status symbols. She had masterfully perfected the devastating art of silent wealth. She fundamentally understood that true, absolute corporate power did not require giant designer logos or desperate, insecure displays of flashy jewelry. Her formidable net worth was measured in highly diversified asset portfolios, controlling vast majority stakes in multinational conglomerates and executing flawless, hostile leveraged buyouts that left veteran Wall Street executives trembling in their boardrooms. The only tangible physical hint of her true, staggering socioeconomic status was securely tucked away in the back seat, completely hidden inside a heavy, opaque garment bag. Inside that protective casing hung a custom $50,000 couture silk gown specifically tailored by a master European design house specifically for the evening's exclusive high society festivities. Beside her in the comfortable leather passenger seat sat her father, Marcus Sterling. He was nervously yet incredibly proudly smoothing the lapels of his charcoal suit with his heavily calloused hands. His thick, scarred hands moved with a gentle reverence over the old fabric, smoothing out invisible wrinkles and adjusting his modest tie. Tonight was the highly anticipated Hawthorne Heritage Gala, which was widely recognized across the state as the absolute most exclusive closed-door gathering of the city's political titans, real estate moguls, and generational wealth elite. Marcus held a thick, heavy gold-foiled VIP invitation securely tucked inside his inner breast pocket, right next to his beating heart. He had been talking about this specific night for 3 straight weeks to absolutely anyone who would actively listen at his local community barbershop and his Sunday church congregation. For a black man who had spent 40 agonizing years working grueling double shifts at the Municipal Transit Authority, cleaning subway cars and driving public buses just to make sure his brilliant, exceptionally gifted daughter could comfortably afford her expensive Ivy League college textbooks, receiving a personalized executive invitation to sit among the city's most powerful operational figures was a profound, life-altering validation. It was a physical, undeniable symbol that his lifelong physical sacrifices, his aching joints, and his silent daily suffering had truly meant something historically significant. It proved unequivocally that his family had finally arrived in the very opulent boardrooms and grand halls where they were historically and systematically denied entry due to decades of institutional redlining, vicious social segregation, and insidious economic disenfranchisement. Maya glanced over at him while idling patiently at a red light, allowing a soft, deeply affectionate smile to temporarily break her usually intensely focused, calculating corporate expression. She saw the pure, unadulterated pride radiating from his weathered, deeply lined face, mixed seamlessly with the undeniable, deep-seated anxiety of stepping into a hostile environment structurally designed from the ground up to keep people exactly like him securely locked outside the wrought iron gates. Maya knew exactly what kind of systemic, insidious gatekeeping existed within the incredibly wealthy, highly guarded walls of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. The organization had a notoriously documented but legally protected history of utilizing vague cultural fit clauses and exorbitant initiation fees to systematically reject highly qualified minority applicants while simultaneously maintaining a pristine public facade of progressive, inclusive philanthropy. That exact institutional hypocrisy and financial arrogance was precisely why her aggressive private equity firm Sterling Holdings had spent the past 6 rigorous months silently and ruthlessly acquiring the country club's severely defaulted commercial real estate loans and completely toxic debt assets through a highly complex, untraceable web of offshore shell corporations. She was absolutely not merely attending this gala as a wealthy, privileged guest looking to network. She was attending as the apex capitalist predator patiently preparing to execute a complete catastrophic corporate restructuring of their entire executive hierarchy. The desperately struggling Hawthorne Heritage Board of Directors had been frantically searching for an anonymous mega-donor to immediately save their heavily mismanaged legacy institution from impending catastrophic federal bankruptcy, and tonight they were strictly scheduled to finally meet their mysterious financial savior in person. Maya found a deep, dark, intensely satisfying sense of poetic justice in the undeniable fact that their absolute savior and incoming owner was a young black woman currently sitting in a faded college sweatshirt, preparing to completely dismantle their racist legacy from the mahogany boardroom down to the marble lobby floor. She expertly navigated the heavy luxury vehicle up to the grand, sweeping, illuminated driveway of the club's majestic, towering entrance. The intimidating Gothic architectural design of the massive stone building was intentionally constructed to project overwhelming historical superiority, featuring massive stone columns and aggressive stone gargoyles deliberately placed to make financial outsiders feel incredibly small and hopelessly insignificant. Maya purposefully stopped the vehicle just short of the bustling, chaotic valet line where young men in pristine white uniforms were frantically sprinting through the freezing rain to open the heavy doors of luxury European sports cars for the arriving elite. The harsh, biting winter wind was howling violently outside the vehicle, sending sharp, freezing gusts of rain against the windshield glass. Maya put the vehicle securely in park and turned completely to face her father. She rapidly analyzed the severe weather conditions and immediately made a tactical, logistical decision. She firmly told him that, under absolutely no circumstances did she want him walking 3 agonizing blocks from the designated public parking garage in this freezing, torrential weather, knowing exactly how deeply the plunging sub-zero temperatures negatively affected his severe arthritic knees. She explicitly instructed him to go straight inside the warm, heavily guarded building, confidently hand his gold-foiled VIP invitation directly to the front desk concierge, and get comfortable in a plush leather wingback chair by the grand lobby fireplace. She promised him in an incredibly soft, reassuring tone that she would personally go park the rental vehicle in the overflow concrete structure, and then take a brief but highly critical corporate conference call regarding a multi-billion-dollar international telecommunications merger. She explicitly stated she needed total absolute silence to verbally authorize the final transfer of massive capital, and legally review the binding merger documents before formally changing into her expensive gala attire in the private executive dressing suites upstairs. She swore she would meet him directly by the grand sweeping marble staircase in exactly 20 minutes so they could walk into the main grand ballroom together arm in arm. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his dark, incredibly intelligent eyes nervously scanning the intimidating towering stone columns and the massive polished brass doors of the exclusionary country club. The deeply ingrained generational trauma of attempting to enter hostile spaces, traditionally reserved exclusively for wealthy white citizens, briefly flashed across his expressive face. He quietly asked her if she was absolutely sure it was socially acceptable for him to walk into that overwhelmingly opulent lobby completely alone without her accompanying him to act as a buffer. Maya reached out across the center console and firmly grabbed his shoulder with an ironclad, undeniable physical reassurance. She looked deeply into his eyes and told him with absolute unwavering conviction that he was a highly honored VIP guest, and that he rightfully belonged in that luxurious room just as much, if not significantly more, than absolutely anyone else currently breathing the heavily conditioned air inside that building. She fiercely reminded him that his literal blood, sweat, and tears had fundamentally built the foundational transportation infrastructure of this very city, while the arrogant, privileged people currently inside that club merely inherited their wealth through untaxed trust funds and generational offshore accounts. With a final incredibly proud nod that clearly conveyed a lifetime of mutual respect and unbreakable familial love, Marcus bravely opened the heavy passenger door and stepped out into the freezing, unforgiving night. He pulled his thin, worn coat tightly around his shoulders and began his determined walk toward the glowing, inviting entrance. Maya watched him go, feeling a massive, surging wave of protective love wash over her before she put the vehicle back into drive and smoothly pulled away toward the dark parking structure. She was completely unaware of the visceral, highly hostile racist confrontation actively waiting for him just beyond those gilded glass doors. And Bradley Preston, the exceptionally arrogant general manager currently standing inside that lobby, aggressively judging the approaching elderly black man by the fraying fabric of his coat, was equally completely unaware of the devastating financial, legal, and professional apocalypse. The billionaire daughter in the faded sweatshirt was fully prepared to violently unleash upon absolutely anyone who dared to compromise her father's hard-earned dignity. The heavy polished brass doors of the Hawthorne Heritage Club closed firmly behind Marcus, instantly sealing away the violently howling winter wind and the freezing torrential downpour. He stepped onto the breathtakingly expensive imported Italian marble floor and was immediately enveloped in an incredibly intoxicating and intentionally suffocating atmosphere of engineered exclusivity. The profoundly quiet, climate-controlled lobby was heated to an exact, perfectly calibrated temperature specifically designed to keep the wealthy elite patrons in their sleeveless silk couture gowns and lightweight bespoke tuxedo jackets comfortably warm. The air inside the grand hall was incredibly thick with the overwhelmingly expensive scent of rare imported cedarwood burning softly in a massive hand-carved stone fireplace, while a live string quartet played a delicate classical arrangement in the far corner of the room. Every single architectural element in the cavernous space, from the soaring vaulted ceilings, adorned with crystal chandeliers, to the heavy velvet drapery cascading down the walls, was strategically designed to project overwhelming historical superiority and financial dominance. It was a space meticulously constructed over centuries to intimidate outsiders and silently reinforce the strict socioeconomic boundaries of the city. Marcus stood quietly for a brief moment just inside the entrance, taking a slow, deep breath to steady his slightly elevated heart rate. He reached up with his heavily calloused hands and gently brushed a few stray droplets of freezing rain from the dark charcoal shoulders of his old Sunday suit. His knees ached with a dull, deep throbbing pain from the cold, damp weather, but he refused to let his physical discomfort alter his incredibly proud and deeply dignified posture. He had spent his entire adult life navigating highly hostile environments, and he fundamentally understood the unspoken rules of this opulent space. He knew that any sudden movements, any signs of physical weakness, or any display of natural hesitation would instantly be weaponized against him by the wealthy patrons and the highly trained security staff currently scanning the room. He squared his broad shoulders, lifted his chin with a quiet, unshakable pride, and began walking slowly and deliberately across the vast expanse of the lobby toward the glowing check-in area. Standing confidently behind a massive custom-built mahogany reception desk that functioned as a literal and psychological barricade between the public street and the private elite sanctuary was Chloe. She was the senior guest relations concierge and the primary institutional gatekeeper of the evening. Chloe was a young, impeccably groomed white woman, possessing that specific type of highly polished, aggressively cheerful corporate facade that masked a deeply ingrained, heavily practiced elitism. She wore a sharply tailored black hospitality uniform featuring a discreet gold lapel pin denoting her senior management status. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a flawless, rigid chignon, and her manicured fingers rested lightly on the screen of an advanced digital access control matrix tablet. She was actively verifying the biometric credentials and the digital access codes of the incoming billionaire philanthropists and influential local politicians. As Marcus approached the glowing mahogany desk, Chloe did not look up immediately. She purposefully kept her eyes fixed intently on her glowing digital tablet, utilizing a classic, deeply insulting hospitality delay tactic specifically designed to make the person standing before her feel entirely subservient and completely invisible. She allowed exactly 15 agonizing seconds of complete silence to pass, forcing Marcus to stand perfectly still and wait for her strictly controlled acknowledgement. When she finally deigned to lift her head, her perfectly practiced, welcoming smile instantly vanished from her face. It was entirely replaced by a tight, heavily guarded expression of immediate suspicion and profound socio-economic disgust. Her sharp, heavily mascaraed eyes conducted a rapid, incredibly invasive visual scan of Marcus from the top of his graying head down to the slightly scuffed toes of his polished leather shoes. She did not see a proud 70-year-old man. She did not see a dedicated father. She simply saw a demographic anomaly, a black man in an outdated suit who fundamentally contradicted the strict racial and financial algorithms of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. Before Marcus could even open his mouth to offer a polite evening greeting, Chloe preemptively raised her perfectly manicured hand, holding up her palm in a universal physical gesture of denial and absolute rejection. She did not welcome him to the club. She did not ask him for his name or his digital reservation code. Instead, she immediately deployed a rapid-fire series of highly offensive, racially coded microaggressions masked as standard operating procedure. She spoke slowly and loudly, utilizing that specific highly condescending tone historically reserved for people deemed intellectually or socially inferior. "Sir," she began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, highly toxic corporate politeness. "The designated delivery entrance for the external catering staff and the temporary utility workers is located entirely around the back of the building near the industrial loading docks. You absolutely cannot be in the main guest lobby. This is a highly secured private ticketed event, and we are currently operating strictly under a closed-door security protocol." Marcus did not shrink under the crushing weight of her immediate, profound disrespect. He did not apologize for his physical presence, and he absolutely did not look down at the floor. He had heard these exact same dismissive, racially coded words thousands of times throughout his long, difficult life in thousands of different structurally racist environments. He maintained eye contact with Chloe, his dark eyes projecting a deep, quiet sorrow for her blatant ignorance paired with an unbreakable, ironclad dignity. He spoke with a rich, deeply resonant voice that carried the heavy weight of absolute truth. "Good evening," Miss Marcus said politely but incredibly firmly, refusing to match her frantic, hostile energy. "I am absolutely not a delivery driver, and I am not a temporary utility worker. I am an officially invited guest attending tonight's gala. My name is Marcus Sterling." Chloe blinked rapidly, experiencing a massive wave of cognitive dissonance. Her deeply entrenched prejudices simply could not process the factual information Marcus had just calmly presented to her. She let out a sharp, incredibly disrespectful scoff, a sound that completely shattered her professional hospitality facade. She leaned forward over the massive mahogany desk, invading his personal space with her aggressive posturing. "Sir," she said, dropping the sickly sweet tone entirely and replacing it with raw, unfiltered hostility. "I personally manage the Master Guest Manifest for the Hawthorne Heritage Board of Directors. Every single individual on my digital list is a verified legacy member, a certified corporate sponsor, or a highly vetted political dignitary. We simply do not issue walk-in access, and we absolutely do not accept unverified solicitations. I strongly suggest you exit through the front doors immediately before I am forced to escalate this minor misunderstanding to our private security team." Marcus remained entirely unmoved by her aggressive verbal threats. The physical and psychological pressure of the opulent room was actively attempting to crush him, to force him back out into the freezing rain where society had violently decided he belonged. But he thought of his brilliant, fiercely protective daughter Maya, currently sitting in the cold parking garage executing billion-dollar corporate acquisitions. He thought of the decades of brutal physical labor he had endured specifically so he could stand proudly in rooms exactly like this one. He calmly reached his scarred, calloused hand into the inner breast pocket of his worn charcoal jacket. He slowly and deliberately withdrew the heavy, thick, gold-foiled VIP invitation. The luxurious, heavy cardstock caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers, reflecting a warm, undeniable golden glow across the polished mahogany desk. The invitation was an exclusive executive access pass, specifically reserved for the highest tier of corporate ownership and anonymous mega donors. Marcus held the heavy, beautiful document gently in his worn fingers and placed it completely flat on the desk, sliding it directly across the polished wood until it rested perfectly beneath Chloe's highly manicured hands. "I am a VIP guest," Marcus repeated, his voice remaining perfectly level and undeniably authoritative. "I suggest you scan the digital barcode printed on the back of the card so I may proceed into the main ballroom and locate my designated seating arrangement." Chloe stared down at the heavy gold-foiled invitation resting on her desk as if it were a highly dangerous radioactive object. She did not reach out to touch it. She did not pick up her digital access scanner to verify the incredibly complex encrypted barcode. Instead, a dark, ugly flush of sheer, absolute arrogance crept up her pale neck and settled into her cheeks. Her deeply ingrained systemic bias completely overrode her basic professional training. In her severely limited, prejudiced worldview, it was mathematically and socially impossible for the elderly black man standing in front of her to legitimately possess the highest tier of executive access ever printed by the country club. Therefore, the invitation simply had to be a complete fabrication, a stolen object, or a highly elaborate scam. She absolutely refused to scan the barcode. She refused to validate his existence in her exclusive database. Instead, she took a dramatic, highly aggressive step back from the mahogany desk and raised her hand into the air, signaling frantically toward the grand archway leading to the executive management offices. She bypassed standard customer service protocols entirely and immediately triggered a severe security escalation. She locked her hostile, furious eyes with Marcus and delivered the final, absolute insult that would permanently set the devastating financial avalanche into motion. "I am not scanning a forged document," Chloe hissed venomously, her voice trembling with misplaced righteous indignation. "You have made a massive, catastrophic mistake coming into this building, old man." She turned her head and shouted across the quiet, luxurious lobby, completely shattering the elegant atmosphere. "Bradley! Mr. Preston! I need absolute immediate management intervention at the front access desk. We have a highly aggressive trespasser attempting to utilize counterfeit credentials." Marcus stood his ground, his jaw tightening slightly as the heavy footsteps of the sharply dressed general manager began echoing rapidly across the marble floor, closing in on him with terrible, undeniable hostility. The ultimate gatekeeper had absolutely refused to open the gate, completely unaware that she had just permanently sealed her own professional doom. The sharp rhythmic clicking of patent leather dress shoes against the imported Italian marble floor cut through the delicate classical music playing in the grand lobby. Bradley Preston, the general manager of the Hawthorne Heritage Club, moved with a predatory, aggressive swiftness. He was a man who physically embodied the strict exclusionary architecture of the institution he fiercely protected. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most working-class families earned in an entire fiscal quarter, Bradley projected an aura of absolute, unchecked authority. Every single detail of his physical appearance was meticulously curated to assert overwhelming socioeconomic dominance, from his expertly coiffed hair to the heavy platinum Rolex aggressively gleaming on his left wrist. As he closed the distance between the executive corridors and the mahogany reception desk, the physical contrast between him and Marcus became violently apparent. Bradley represented generations of unearned, inherited privilege moving through the world with a frantic, arrogant entitlement. Marcus stood completely still, anchoring himself with the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a man who had literally built the physical infrastructure of the city with his own calloused hands. The heavy, suffocating pressure in the room was not merely social, it was strictly temporal. Standing majestically in the center of the grand lobby was a massive, antique mahogany grandfather clock, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. The ornate gold hands of the clock rested precisely at 6:48 in the evening. There were exactly 12 minutes remaining until the absolute most critical moment in the country club's long, prestigious history. At exactly 7 o'clock, the mayor was strictly scheduled to take the grand stage in the main ballroom to deliver his highly anticipated keynote address. But far more importantly, the desperately struggling board of directors was scheduled to publicly unveil the identity of their anonymous mega donor, the mysterious financial savior who had single-handedly rescued the heavily mismanaged legacy institution from impending catastrophic federal bankruptcy. The executive stakes were unimaginably high. The entire local political machine and the regional financial elite were currently gathered in the adjacent room, expecting a flawless, spectacular presentation. Bradley was already operating under a massive amount of internal corporate pressure, his highly fragile ego terrified of a single operational failure. When his hostile eyes locked onto the elderly black man standing peacefully in his pristine lobby, that internal executive panic instantly violently mutated into external racial hostility. Bradley arrived at the reception desk and did not even afford Marcus the basic human courtesy of a direct greeting. Instead, he leaned in close to his senior concierge, Chloe, conducting a rapid, highly dismissive whispered debriefing right in front of Marcus, as if the elderly gentleman was completely deaf or intellectually incapable of understanding their conversation. Chloe eagerly fed his deeply entrenched prejudices, frantically whispering about unauthorized entry protocols and aggressive solicitation tactics. Bradley nodded, his jaw clenching with righteous indignation before he finally turned his entire body to face Marcus. He looked at the worn charcoal fabric of Marcus' suit and the slightly scuffed leather of his shoes, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Listen to me very carefully," Bradley commanded, his voice projecting across the quiet lobby, utilizing a highly weaponized corporate tone designed to maximize public humiliation. "I am the general manager of this private estate, and you have currently breached a highly secured executive perimeter. We are exactly 11 minutes away from hosting the most significant philanthropic reveal in the modern history of this state. The absolute last thing I am going to allow is a confused, wandering individual disrupting the meticulously curated aesthetic of my lobby." Marcus did not shrink back from the verbal assault. He maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with the arrogant manager. "I am not wandering, and I am certainly not confused," Marcus replied, his deeply resonant voice projecting a profound, steady calm that completely infuriated Bradley. "I am an invited guest. I have already presented my executive access credentials to your front desk staff." Bradley let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed harshly against the vaulted ceilings. He snatched the heavy, gold-foiled VIP invitation off the mahogany desk with a violent, aggressive motion, completely disrespecting the physical document. He held it up to the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers, squinting his eyes in a theatrical, exaggerated display of scrutiny. The grandfather clock chimed a low, single note, signaling the passing of another minute. 6:49. The temporal pressure was actively crushing the air out of the room. "You actually expect me to believe this is a legitimate document?" Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venomous sarcasm. "This specific gold-foiled credential is an incredibly highly restricted Tier 1 access pass. It is exclusively reserved for our majority corporate shareholders and our anonymous philanthropic benefactors. It is an encrypted proprietary asset. And quite frankly, looking at your current state of attire and considering your obvious demographic profile, the statistical probability of you legitimately possessing this asset is exactly 0. This is a counterfeit, and it is not even a particularly sophisticated fabrication." The blatant, unapologetic racism embedded within his corporate jargon hung heavily in the air. Bradley was not merely accusing Marcus of lying, he was completely denying Marcus the fundamental right to exist within the same socio-economic stratosphere as the people in the adjacent ballroom. Marcus felt a familiar deep ache in his chest, not from fear, but from a profound exhaustion. He had fought this exact battle in banks and real estate offices and in hospital waiting rooms for 5 consecutive decades. "I assure you the document is entirely authentic," Marcus stated firmly, his broad shoulders squaring against the hostility. "If you simply utilize the digital scanner on your desk, you will clearly see my name registered in your master database. I strongly suggest you do your job properly before you make an irreversible professional mistake." The calm, authoritative nature of Marcus' response struck Bradley like a physical blow. Men like Bradley Preston were absolutely not accustomed to being spoken to with such quiet, commanding authority by men who looked like Marcus. His fragile ego shattered completely, triggering a severe escalation in his aggressive tactics. He slammed the heavy VIP invitation back down onto the polished mahogany desk with a loud, violent crack. The heavy brass pendulum of the grandfather clock continued its relentless swing. Tick, tick. 6:50 in the evening. 10 minutes remaining until the absolute deadline. "You have incredible audacity coming into my facility and attempting to dictate operational protocol to me," Bradley hissed, leaning aggressively over the desk, his face turning a dark, angry shade of crimson. "You do not belong here. You have never belonged here. And you will never belong here. You are actively trespassing on private corporate property, utilizing fraudulent financial documents to attempt to gain access to highly secure areas. That constitutes federal fraud and criminal trespassing." Bradley raised his hand and violently snapped his fingers, a deeply degrading gesture typically reserved for summoning obedient animals. 2 massive private security guards, wearing tactical earpieces and tightly fitted dark suits, immediately detached themselves from their designated post near the grand staircase and began marching heavily toward the reception desk. The physical threat of state-sanctioned violence had officially entered the equation. The wealthy white patrons lingering in the lobby stopped their hushed conversations, entirely turning their heads to watch the confrontation unfold with a sickening voyeuristic fascination. "I am giving you exactly one final opportunity to salvage whatever dignity you think you have left," Bradley threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous guttural register. "The time is exactly 6:50. You have exactly 30 seconds to turn around and walk your counterfeit documents out of my lobby. If you are still standing on this Italian marble when that clock ticks over to the next minute, I will instruct my security team to physically restrain you. I will personally call the chief of police, who is currently drinking my champagne in the next room, and I will have you violently dragged out of this building in steel handcuffs in front of every single camera crew waiting outside. The ultimatum hung in the heavily perfumed air, toxic and absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow exponentially louder, echoing like a war drum. 6:51. 9 minutes to the mayor's speech. 9 minutes to the mega donor reveal. The security guard stopped exactly 2 feet behind Marcus, their heavy, aggressive breathing audible in the tense silence. Their large hands flexed eagerly, anticipating the violent physical altercation. Bradley stood tall behind his mahogany fortress, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his lips, firmly believing he had successfully defended his exclusionary castle. He looked at Marcus, waiting for the elderly man to finally break, to finally bow his head in submission and scurry back out into the freezing rain. But Marcus did not move a single muscle. He stood like an ancient, deeply rooted oak tree, weathering the violent storm completely unshaken and completely unbroken, waiting for the silent wealth of his daughter to arrive and violently shatter their entire racist empire into dust. The physical atmosphere within the grand lobby of the Hawthorne Heritage Club began to violently shift, transforming from a space of hushed aristocratic leisure into a localized theater of public humiliation. The wealthy patrons, who had previously been entirely absorbed in their hushed conversations regarding corporate mergers and offshore tax havens, completely ceased their activities. They began to slowly, instinctively gravitate toward the mahogany reception desk, forming a suffocating psychological perimeter around Marcus. This was the physical manifestation of the white gaze, a collective heavy stare dripping with historical entitlement and unspoken hostility. The visual contrast was jarring and deeply uncomfortable. Women draped in thousands of dollars of flawless diamonds and men wearing imported Italian silk suits stood shoulder to shoulder, their posture rigid with inherent bias. They looked at the worn, fraying edges of Marcus Charcoal's suit, not with basic human empathy, but with a profound socio-economic disgust. They were a community that violently protected their exclusive borders, and Marcus was standing completely alone right in the middle of their sacred sanctuary. Marcus remained perfectly still, anchoring his feet to the cold marble floor while the immense weight of their collective judgment threatened to crush his spine. His internal monologue was a masterclass in psychological survival. He deeply understood the incredibly dangerous dynamic actively playing out around him. He felt the burning stares penetrating his worn jacket, analyzing his mere existence as a structural threat to their generational wealth. He knew exactly what they were silently waiting for. They desperately wanted him to lose his temper. They wanted him to raise his voice, to flail his arms, to give them the aggressive physical reaction that would instantly validate their deeply entrenched racial prejudices. If he displayed even a fraction of the righteous anger currently boiling in his chest, they would immediately label him an angry, dangerous intruder. They would use his justified frustration to authorize the 2 massive private security guards to brutally assault him right there on the pristine marble floor. Marcus refused to give them that absolute satisfaction. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, filling his lungs and actively regulating his resting heart rate. He retreated into a quiet, impenetrable fortress of immense personal dignity. He thought of the 40 years of grueling physical labor he had endured building the very metropolitan transit systems these arrogant people utilized daily. His calloused hands were a testament to genuine, honest sacrifice, while their manicured fingers had only ever signed trust fund dividend checks. But in the modern digital era, the violent architecture of public humiliation is no longer strictly confined to physical spaces. It is immediately weaponized and broadcasted globally. From the densely packed circle of wealthy onlookers, a young man stepped slightly forward. He was a legacy member, perhaps 19 years old, wearing a highly fashionable velvet dinner jacket and an expression of profound, entitled boredom. Recognizing a highly volatile situation that could generate massive digital engagement, he casually reached into his tailored pocket and withdrew a sleek top-tier smartphone. With a few quick taps of his thumb, he opened a social media broadcasting application and initiated a live video stream. He held the camera lens up, directly focusing the high-definition sensor entirely on Marcus and Bradley, completely stripping away the elderly man's fundamental right to basic privacy. The young man typed a highly derogatory caption framing the severe racial profiling incident as mere digital entertainment for his followers. The highly advanced algorithmic infrastructure of the application instantly recognized the high-conflict visual parameters of the broadcast and immediately began pushing the live feed to thousands of mobile devices across the country. The digital spectator count located in the upper corner of the glowing screen began to surge with terrifying exponential speed. It jumped from 100 viewers to 500 viewers, and then violently spiked to over 3,000 viewers in a matter of seconds. The digital interface became a chaotic waterfall of real-time textual reactions scrolling upward so rapidly it was nearly impossible to read every single line. Yet the collective voice of the internet began to bleed into the physical reality of the country club. The initial comments were driven by absolute confusion and immediate outrage. Users across the globe were typing frantic messages watching a dignified elderly black man being aggressively cornered by heavily armed private security forces over a piece of gold-foiled cardstock. The digital comments surged relentlessly. One user typed that this was the most blatant example of racial profiling they had ever witnessed on a live feed. Another user rapidly commented noting the extreme physical contrast between the arrogant red-faced general manager and the quietly composed elderly gentleman. Thousands of digital spectators were collectively analyzing the exact make and model of Bradley's expensive tuxedo, while simultaneously defending Marcus' right to simply exist in a public lobby. The viewer metric skyrocketed past 10,000 active watchers, fundamentally altering the entire socio-political dynamic of the dispute. It was no longer a localized incident of private discrimination, it was rapidly mutating into a massive, highly publicized corporate scandal. Marcus caught the unnatural glare of the smartphone camera lens out of his peripheral vision. His deeply intelligent eyes tracked the glowing digital screen, and he instantly comprehended the severe escalation of the situational parameters. The introduction of the live broadcast meant his physical safety was now entirely dependent on his absolute flawless composure. He was being digitally consumed by tens of thousands of strangers who were actively waiting to see if he would become a tragic victim of state-sanctioned violence or a viral symbol of stoic resistance. He maintained his incredibly strict physical discipline, refusing to even blink as the aggressive security guards took another intimidating step closer. His internal monologue shifted from quiet endurance to a deeply analytical tactical assessment. He knew his incredibly powerful billionaire daughter Maya was currently sitting in the concrete parking structure holding the absolute financial authority to completely decimate this entire racist institution. He just needed to hold the psychological line for a few more agonizing minutes. He focused his mind entirely on the profound, undeniable truth that he legally possessed the highest tier of executive access within that building, regardless of what the arrogant manager desperately claimed. Bradley Preston, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic digital avalanche actively forming right in front of him. The general manager was a man completely blinded by his own systemic privilege and inflated corporate ego. When Bradley noticed the young wealthy patron filming the altercation, his reaction was entirely counterproductive to basic crisis management protocols. Instead of immediately de-escalating the highly volatile situation to protect the prestigious reputation of the Hawthorne Heritage Club, Bradley actually felt profoundly emboldened by the presence of a recording device. He falsely believed that the camera would perfectly document his authoritative leadership and his strict, uncompromising defense of the club's exclusionary bylaws. He stood taller behind the mahogany reception desk, puffing out his tailored chest and aggressively projecting his voice so the smartphone microphone would clearly capture his commands. Bradley began playing directly to the gathered crowd of wealthy bystanders and the glowing camera lens. He utilized heavy specialized corporate terminology to mask his blatant racial bias, attempting to intellectualize his discrimination. He loudly declared that the facility was currently operating under a code-red executive security protocol and that Marcus represented a highly critical operational vulnerability. He stated that the gold-foiled invitation resting on the desk was a mathematically impossible anomaly, clearly indicating a sophisticated fraudulent breach of their proprietary ticketing matrix. Every single word Bradley arrogantly spoke was being instantly captured, transmitted, and violently dissected by a massive global audience of increasingly furious digital spectators. The internet users began actively identifying the country club, recognizing the distinct Gothic architectural features and the custom mahogany millwork. Digital sleuths in the live chat were already rapidly compiling the corporate phone numbers, the executive email addresses, and the public board of director profiles associated with the Hawthorne Heritage Club. The suffocating physical tension in the lobby reached an absolute critical mass. The live broadcast viewer count violently eclipsed 20,000 active participants, creating an unprecedented level of real-time public scrutiny. The wealthy white patrons surrounding Marcus continued to whisper their toxic endorsements, completely unaware that their exclusive sanctuary was currently burning to the ground in the digital realm. Marcus stood silently in the direct center of this horrific storm, completely isolated, yet possessing an undeniable monolithic strength. The violent friction between the oppressive physical reality of the country club and the surging democratic outrage of the digital livestream created a terrifying temporal pressure. The grandfather clock continued its relentless heavy ticking, echoing against the marble floors, counting down the final precious seconds before the absolute ultimate collision of systemic racism and unprecedented silent wealth. The stage was perfectly set, the audience was incredibly massive, and the ultimate karma was rapidly approaching the front doors. The standoff in the lobby of the Hawthorne Heritage Club had officially bypassed verbal negotiation and entered a highly volatile state of impending physical altercation. Bradley Preston stood rigidly behind the massive mahogany reception desk, experiencing a catastrophic failure of his standard intimidation tactics. In his entire professional tenure as a luxury hospitality executive, he had never encountered an unauthorized individual who completely refused to submit to his aggressive verbal directives. The wealthy white patrons surrounding them were entirely accustomed to a world where their mere presence demanded absolute compliance from minority individuals. Yet Marcus stood before them as an immovable object possessing a profound stoic resilience that completely short-circuited Bradley's prejudiced expectations. The general manager realized with a sickening jolt to his fragile ego that utilizing specialized corporate jargon and threatening legal action was fundamentally insufficient to break the spirit of the elderly black man standing on his marble floor. Bradley needed a definitive theatrical display of absolute authority to visually re-establish his dominance in front of his elite clientele and the glowing smartphone camera actively broadcasting his every move. Bradley looked down at the heavy gold-foiled VIP invitation resting on the polished mahogany surface. That single piece of encrypted cardstock represented the ultimate executive privilege within their socio-economic ecosystem. It was a tangible symbol of immense financial power and structural access. To Bradley, the absolute impossibility of Marcus legitimately possessing that proprietary asset was an insult to the institutional integrity of the club. Bradley reached out with his perfectly manicured hands and snatched the heavy invitation off the desk. He did not merely pick it up, he seized it with a violent, aggressive motion designed to signal the immediate revocation of any implied guest rights. He held the beautiful, thick cardstock up high so the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers caught the shimmering gold foil, ensuring that every single wealthy bystander and the digital audience watching the live stream could clearly witness his next action. "This is not a legitimate corporate credential," Bradley declared, his voice echoing with a toxic theatrical resonance. "This is a fraudulently obtained asset, attempting to compromise a highly secured executive environment. Under the strict operational bylaws of the Hawthorne Heritage Board of Directors, any unauthorized individual attempting to utilize counterfeit documentation forfeits said documentation immediately." With a sharp, violently exaggerated motion, Bradley clamped his hands tightly on either side of the heavy cardstock. The ambient classical music playing softly in the background seemed to completely fade away, leaving only the sickening, deeply disrespectful sound of the thick paper fibers violently tearing. He ripped the gold-foiled invitation cleanly in half. The sharp, tearing sound echoed against the vaulted ceilings, striking the silent lobby like a physical blow. It was an act of profound, unchecked aggression. It was not merely the destruction of a piece of paper, it was the deliberate public mutilation of Marcus' dignity. Bradley held the two torn halves up for a brief, triumphant second, proudly displaying his destructive handiwork to his elite audience. Then, with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, he opened his hands and simply let the pieces drop. The heavy torn halves fluttered downward, landing directly onto the cold, imported Italian marble floor, stopping precisely at the slightly scuffed toes of Marcus' leather shoes. "You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out that front door before I have you violently arrested for criminal trespassing and federal fraud," Bradley hissed, his voice dropping into a guttural, highly threatening register. "If you are still standing in my lobby when the clock strikes 7, I will personally instruct my security team to physically restrain you until local law enforcement arrives to drag you away in steel handcuffs." The collective gasp from the wealthy onlookers was barely audible, quickly replaced by a toxic, silent approval of the manager's brutal enforcement of their exclusive borders. Marcus looked down at the torn pieces of his invitation resting on the floor. For a fraction of a second, the sheer weight of the systemic humiliation threatened to fracture his composure. He thought of the immense pride he had felt just an hour earlier, carefully tucking that beautiful invitation into his breast pocket. He thought of the profound validation it represented after 40 years of breaking his back for a society that actively despised him. And now that validation lay violently shredded at his feet, destroyed by an arrogant man who had absolutely no concept of genuine sacrifice. But Marcus did not break. He did not yell or curse or give Bradley the aggressive physical reaction the manager so desperately craved. Instead, Marcus made a decision rooted in an unbreakable, ironclad self-respect. He would not allow this arrogant institution to keep his stolen property even if it was destroyed. He slowly bent his knees, A sharp, agonizing jolt of deep arthritic pain shot through his joints, a direct physical consequence of decades spent performing grueling manual labor on the concrete platforms of the municipal transit system. The physical descent was slow and incredibly painful, but Marcus maintained his upright posture, refusing to bow his head or show any outward sign of weakness. He reached down with his heavily calloused, scarred hands and gently picked up the 2 torn pieces of the gold-foiled cardstock from the cold floor. The visual image of the dignified elderly black man forced to bend down and collect his shredded dignity under the hostile gaze of wealthy white elites was profoundly devastating. It was a stark, violent representation of historical oppression actively manifesting in a modern corporate space. In the digital realm, the live stream broadcasting this horrific scene completely exploded. The viewer metric violently surged past 30,000 active participants, creating a massive, unprecedented wave of democratic outrage. The digital chat interface transformed into a blindingly fast waterfall of furious text. Thousands of internet users across the country collectively gasped in absolute horror as they watched Bradley physically destroy the invitation. The digital comments rapidly shifted from concerned observation to an aggressive, unified demand for absolute justice. Users typed frantic messages calling the general manager a monster and demanding the immediate termination of his employment. Viewers began actively tagging local news agencies, civil rights organizations, and prominent political figures, desperately trying to flood the club with external accountability. They recognized the brutal elder abuse and the blatant racial degradation actively unfolding on their glowing screens, and they were entirely powerless to physically intervene. The digital audience was experiencing the exact same helpless rage that Marcus had endured his entire life. Inside the lobby, the physical tension reached an absolute critical mass, stretching the psychological rubber band to its absolute breaking point. Bradley Preston, emboldened by his own destructive act and entirely misreading Marcus' quiet retrieval of the invitation as an act of submissive defeat, decided to execute the final stage of his hostile perimeter defense. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, aggressive tactical signal to the 2 massive private security guards standing mere feet away from Marcus. "Remove this individual from the premises immediately," Bradley commanded, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. "Utilize whatever physical force protocols are deemed necessary to secure the lobby." The spatial dynamics of the lobby felt as though they were violently compressing. The opulent crystal chandeliers suspended high above cast long, aggressive shadows across the marble floor, visually isolating Marcus in a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The sweet, heavy fragrance of the imported cedar wood burning in the grand fireplace suddenly smelled metallic and suffocating, a stark contrast to the cold, freezing reality waiting just beyond the heavy brass entrance doors. Bradley Preston leaned forward over the mahogany reception desk, his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped the polished wood. A sickeningly triumphant smirk began to pull at the corners of his mouth. He was absolutely convinced that he had successfully defended his gated community from what he perceived as a hostile lower-class invasion. He felt a surge of toxic adrenaline, a dark thrill at utilizing his corporate authority to physically punish a man who dared to challenge the strict racial algorithms of his domain. The 2 security guards moved with a practiced, terrifying synchronization. These were men hired specifically for their intimidating physical mass and their complete lack of hesitation when ordered to utilize force against unauthorized individuals. Their polished black tactical shoes scraped against the marble floor, a sharp grating sound that cut through the absolute silence of the surrounding crowd. As they encroached upon Marcus, they completely blocked his line of sight to the front doors, intentionally trapping him in a highly aggressive physical blockade. The guard on the left, a man with a thick neck and cold, dead eyes, aggressively positioned his body to block any potential lateral movement. The guard on the right lowered his center of gravity, preparing to utilize a specialized law enforcement takedown maneuver designed to instantly drop a non-compliant subject to the ground. Marcus felt the displacement of air as the massive guards closed in around him. He could clearly see the aggressive tension in their jaws and the violent intent flashing in their eyes. He knew exactly how this specific scenario historically ended for men who looked like him. He knew that any defensive physical movement, any natural instinct to simply shield his face or swat away their grabbing hands would instantly be classified as resisting security personnel. That classification would immediately provide them with the legal and corporate justification to escalate from a physical escort to a brutal, violent assault. They would forcefully drive his aging, arthritic body into the hard marble floor. They would crush his chest beneath their heavy knees, and they would snap steel handcuffs onto his wrists, while the wealthy crowd watched with passive, silent approval. The live stream capturing this agonizing sequence was now completely vibrating with chaotic digital energy. Over 35,000 people were collectively holding their breath, trapped in a state of paralyzing digital anxiety. The comments flew across the screen faster than the human eye could process, filled with absolute rage, terror, and desperate pleas for intervention. The digital community recognized that they were witnessing a profound systemic failure, a moment where the protective laws of society were completely suspended to accommodate the violent prejudices of the wealthy elite. The sheer volume of digital data surging through the club's local cellular towers was immense, a silent, invisible storm of democratic accountability rapidly converging on the exact geographical coordinates of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. Yet inside the suffocating physical reality of the lobby, the digital storm remained completely unheard. There was only the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock, the harsh, aggressive breathing of the security operatives, and the cold, violent reality of systemic racism preparing to strike. Marcus clutched the torn pieces of his VIP invitation, feeling the sharp edges of the thick cardstock pressing deeply into his calloused palm. It was the only tangible proof he had of his right to exist in this space, and Bradley had violently reduced it to garbage. The security guard's large hands finally made physical contact. The operative on the left violently grabbed the shoulder of Marcus' worn charcoal suit jacket, his thick fingers aggressively digging into the old fabric. The operative on the right simultaneously seized Marcus' left bicep, applying an immediate painful pressure designed to completely immobilize the elderly man's arm. The physical violation was absolute. The tipping point had been officially crossed. The heavy rubber band of socioeconomic tension and racial hostility had been stretched past its absolute physical limit, and it was currently snapping back with devastating destructive force. Bradley Preston stood tall behind his mahogany fortress, watching the physical apprehension with an expression of pure, arrogant satisfaction, entirely convinced he had won. The wealthy patrons leaned in closer, their eyes wide with toxic fascination, eagerly awaiting the final violent expulsion of the intruder. Marcus stood trapped firmly between the two massive guards, his incredibly proud posture violently compromised by their aggressive physical holds. The entire lobby was completely suspended in a horrific, paralyzing moment of absolute injustice, waiting for the final devastating blow to fall. The freezing winter rain violently lashed against the massive stone exterior of the Hawthorne Heritage Club as Maya Sterling concluded her international telecommunications merger. She sat in the driver's seat of her rented utility vehicle parked in the concrete overflow structure, securely locking her encrypted smartphone after verbally authorizing a multi-billion-dollar capital transfer. The absolute magnitude of the financial transaction she had just executed would have left veteran Wall Street executives trembling with adrenaline, but Maya felt nothing but a cold, calculated, absolute calm. She stepped out of the vehicle and into the biting wind, completely unbothered by the freezing temperatures. She wore a faded, oversized gray Howard University hooded sweatshirt, simple black athletic leggings, and mud-splattered running shoes. She carried no designer handbag and wore no flashy jewelry. Her long, dark hair was pulled back tightly into a highly practical, functional bun at the nape of her neck. She looked entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye, projecting the ultimate manifestation of silent wealth. She fundamentally understood that true, absolute power did not require validation from external aesthetic markers. Her net worth was securely measured in highly diversified asset portfolios and majority stakes in multinational conglomerates, not in the superficial labels stitched into the lining of a jacket. She walked purposefully across the wet pavement toward the grand entrance of the country club, entirely prepared to change into her $50,000 custom silk couture gown, waiting securely in her garment bag. She reached the heavy polished brass doors of the main lobby and pushed them open, stepping out of the violent winter storm and directly into a perfectly calibrated atmospheric bubble of extreme aristocratic privilege. The heavy brass doors sealed shut behind her, cutting off the howling wind and instantly replacing it with the delicate sounds of a live classical string quartet and the hushed murmurs of the city's most elite citizens. As Maya stepped onto the imported Italian marble floor, the stark visual contrast between her physical presence and the highly engineered environment was violently jarring. She was a living, breathing socioeconomic anomaly walking directly into an exclusionary ecosystem, specifically designed to aggressively reject people who looked exactly like her. The grand lobby was completely saturated with the overwhelming visual markers of generational wealth. Women draped in thousands of dollars of flawless diamonds and imported European silk couture gowns glided across the room, while men wearing bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedos and heavy platinum luxury timepieces stood in tight exclusive circles. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of rare imported cedar wood and incredibly expensive designer perfumes. But Maya did not feel intimidated by the opulent architecture or the aggressive displays of superficial status. She viewed the entire country club through the cold, highly analytical lens of an apex corporate predator, actively surveying a newly acquired asset. She knew exactly what these people were completely unaware of. She knew that her private equity firm Sterling Holdings officially held the majority executive voting rights to the very ground they were currently standing on. She owned the marble beneath their expensive shoes, she owned the crystal chandeliers hanging above their heads, and she owned the highly toxic corporate debt that had nearly driven their precious institution into catastrophic federal bankruptcy. As she moved further into the cavernous lobby, her sharp, calculating eyes rapidly scanned the physical environment, processing visual data with terrifying speed and absolute precision. She immediately noticed an abnormal concentration of wealthy patrons gathered tightly near the massive, custom-built mahogany reception desk. The usual hushed, aristocratic decorum of the space had completely fractured, replaced by a highly toxic, tense atmosphere of collective voyeurism. Maya saw a young legacy member holding a highly advanced smartphone up in the air, actively broadcasting the unfolding situation to a massive live digital audience. She recognized the specific glowing interface of a major social media platform, and her brilliant mind instantly calculated the severe public relations ramifications and the massive liability metrics actively accumulating against the country club. She continued her visual sweep, cutting through the crowd of wealthy white bystanders who were entirely too engrossed in their sick entertainment to notice the billionaire walking silently among them in a faded college sweatshirt. Then the crowd shifted slightly, and Maya finally saw the absolute center of the conflict. The cold, calculated calm that had previously anchored her physical posture instantly solidified into a terrifying, impenetrable layer of absolute freezing ice. Standing completely trapped in the direct center of a hostile physical blockade was her father. Marcus Sterling stood with his incredibly proud back straight, his jaw clenched and his dark eyes projecting an unbreakable, monumental dignity. But he was physically surrounded by two massive private security operatives, their heavy, aggressive hands violently gripping the worn charcoal fabric of his suit jacket. And standing safely behind the impenetrable fortress of the mahogany reception desk was a man Maya immediately identified as the primary operational liability. It was Bradley Preston, the general manager of the estate. Bradley was leaning forward aggressively, his perfectly manicured face flushed a dark, toxic shade of crimson, radiating a pathetic, fragile arrogance. He was actively projecting his voice, utilizing weaponized corporate jargon to publicly humiliate the man who had sacrificed his entire life to build Maya's empire. Maya stopped completely still, allowing her highly analytical mind to process the horrific scene playing out right in front of her. She looked down at the cold marble floor and saw the heavy gold-foiled VIP invitation she had personally handed to her father earlier that evening. It was completely shredded, violently torn, perfectly in half, and discarded at his feet like meaningless garbage. The sight of that destroyed proprietary asset, the ultimate symbol of executive access, violently rejected by an arrogant middle management employee, triggered a profound shift in Maya's internal operational protocol. She did not feel a sudden burst of hot, chaotic anger. Hot anger was sloppy, unpredictable, and highly unprofessional. What Maya felt was a cold, absolute zero-temperature rage. It was the exact same psychological state she entered when executing a ruthless, hostile corporate takeover of a deeply corrupt multinational conglomerate. She immediately deactivated any remaining traces of basic social empathy and fully engaged her executive execution protocols. She rapidly analyzed Bradley Preston, dissecting his physical posture and his loud, aggressive behavior. She saw right through his expensive designer tuxedo and his heavy platinum watch. She recognized him instantly, not as a powerful man, but as a terrified, deeply insecure institutional gatekeeper desperately clinging to a racist socioeconomic hierarchy that was actively crumbling beneath his feet. He was a man who utilized loud, dramatic aggression to mask his fundamental lack of genuine executive power. He was an obsolete, algorithmic error in her newly acquired corporate structure, and she was entirely prepared to violently delete him from the system. She mentally retrieved the exact legal phrasing of Section 8, Clause 4 of the Hawthorne Heritage Executive Employment Contract, which explicitly outlined the immediate, uncompensated termination protocols for gross professional misconduct and severe violations of the Federal Civil Rights Act. She weaponized the legal terminology in her mind, preparing to deploy it with maximum devastating efficiency. Maya began to walk slowly toward the center of the conflict, her running shoes making absolutely no sound against the imported marble. Her physical movements were incredibly deliberate, highly controlled, and completely devoid of any frantic emotional energy. She did not rush, she did not yell to her father, and she did not aggressively demand the attention of the surrounding crowd. She moved with the quiet, terrifying inevitability of a massive incoming tidal wave, pulling back from the shoreline right before a catastrophic impact. The wealthy patrons standing on the periphery of the conflict finally began to notice her silent approach. They turned their heads, looking at her faded, oversized hooded sweatshirt and her simple athletic leggings with immediate, profound disgust. They instinctively stepped back, creating a narrow pathway for her simply to avoid any physical contact with what they entirely perceived as a member of the lower class. They had absolutely no idea they were actively stepping aside for the ultimate owner of their entire exclusive universe. The temporal pressure in the grand lobby was actively screaming. The massive antique mahogany grandfather clock ticked relentlessly forward, rapidly approaching the 7 o'clock deadline for the major philanthropic reveal. The two massive security operatives tightened their violent physical grip on Marcus' shoulders, preparing to forcefully execute the physical apprehension protocols authorized by the arrogant manager. The wealthy digital spectators watching the massive live broadcast were typing frantic, chaotic messages, completely paralyzed by the horrific systemic injustice playing out on their glowing screens. Bradley Preston stood tall behind his mahogany desk, a sick, triumphant smile twisting his lips, completely certain of his absolute authority. He was actively waiting for the elderly black man to finally shatter under the crushing weight of their institutional racism. But Maya Sterling was now actively inside the perimeter. The silent wealth had successfully breached the heavily guarded gates. She closed the final few feet of distance, stepping completely out of the peripheral shadows and directly into the harsh, unforgiving light of the massive crystal chandeliers. She positioned her body utilizing absolute precision, stepping directly into the highly volatile physical space, separating the aggressive security operatives from the mahogany reception desk. She did not look at the wealthy bystanders whispering toxic insults behind their manicured hands. She did not look at the glowing lens of the smartphone camera, actively broadcasting the confrontation to the world. She focused her cold, calculating apex predator eyes entirely on the chaotic, aggressive scene, actively threatening her father's dignity, entirely prepared to unleash a level of absolute financial and legal devastation that this exclusionary institution had never before witnessed in its entire prestigious history. The physical space separating the two massive private security operatives and Marcus Sterling was violently breached not by physical force, but by an overwhelming atmospheric shift. Maya Sterling stepped directly into the highly volatile containment zone with the absolute frictionless glide of a phantom. She did not physically shove the operatives aside. She simply occupied the space with such a staggering concentration of apex corporate authority that the two heavily armed men instinctively recoiled. Their tactical training fundamentally failed them in the face of her cold, undeniable gravitational pull. One moment they were violently gripping the worn charcoal fabric of Marcus' suit jacket, and the next moment their large, aggressive hands were completely empty, hovering uselessly in the cold, heavily perfumed air. Maya placed herself directly between the aggressive hostility of the Hawthorne Heritage Club and the quiet, unbroken dignity of her father. She became an instantaneous, impenetrable physical and psychological shield. The harsh, unforgiving light of the crystal chandeliers suspended high above the imported Italian marble floor suddenly seemed to bend around her, framing her faded, oversized gray Howard University hooded sweatshirt as if it were a suit of custom-forged titanium armor. Maya completely turned her back to the massive mahogany reception desk and the deeply arrogant general manager standing behind it. In a situation completely saturated with high-stakes confrontation, the absolute most insulting action a person can take is to deny their aggressor basic visual acknowledgement. Maya executed this psychological maneuver flawlessly. She directed her entire focus, her brilliant, calculating mind, and her fierce, protective love entirely onto Marcus. She reached out with her steady hands and gently gripped his broad shoulders. Her physical touch was incredibly grounding, instantly absorbing the violent kinetic energy the security guards had just inflicted upon his aging joints. She looked deeply into his dark, intelligent eyes, conducting a rapid but highly thorough physical and emotional assessment. She saw the deep arthritic pain radiating through his knees from the forced physical compression. She saw the profound systemic humiliation actively attempting to fracture his spirit. But most importantly, she saw the undeniable monumental pride that he had maintained despite the horrific corporate abuse. "Are you physically injured, Dad?" she asked, her voice incredibly soft, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of the chaotic panic that the wealthy bystanders desperately expected to hear. Her voice carried the steady rhythmic cadence of a highly experienced chief executive officer maintaining absolute operational control during a catastrophic institutional failure. Marcus looked at his brilliant daughter standing fearlessly in the center of the hostile aristocratic sanctuary. A slow, deeply relieved breath escaped his lungs. "I am perfectly fine, Maya," he replied, his rich, resonant voice regaining its full structural integrity. "But I believe the management here has made a severe administrative error regarding our executive access credentials." Standing entirely ignored behind his fortified mahogany desk, Bradley Preston experienced a massive, catastrophic short circuit of his fragile corporate ego. He was the supreme operational authority of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. He was accustomed to complete unconditional obedience from his staff and immediate deferential respect from the wealthy patrons. The visual reality of a young black woman dressed in cheap athletic streetwear, casually walking into his highly secured perimeter and completely neutralizing his tactical security operatives was psychologically incomprehensible to him. His perfectly manicured face contorted into a deeply ugly mask of unfiltered hostility and profound classist disgust. The toxic adrenaline surging through his bloodstream completely overrode his standard hospitality training. Great Bradley sneered, his voice echoing sharply across the cavernous lobby, dripping with aggressive, sarcastic venom. The rest of the trespassing family has officially arrived to disrupt the premises. I should have completely anticipated this highly predictable demographic behavior. Bradley leaned aggressively over the polished wood of the reception desk, desperately attempting to physically project his diminishing authority over the space. He pointed his trembling finger directly at Maya's faded hooded sweatshirt, utilizing weaponized corporate terminology to mask his blatant racial profiling. "Listen to me very carefully, you unauthorized individual," Bradley commanded, his volume escalating into a frantic, highly unprofessional shout. "You have fundamentally breached a code-red executive security perimeter. This is a strictly enforced private ticketed event, reserved exclusively for verified corporate sponsors and legacy members. You do not possess the appropriate aesthetic attire, the required financial standing, or the digital biometric clearance to occupy this lobby. Your presence here is a catastrophic liability to our operational aesthetic. I am officially ordering both of you to turn around and exit this facility immediately before I authorize my security operatives to utilize maximum physical force to secure the building." The incredibly tense atmosphere in the grand lobby stretched to an agonizing absolute limit. The wealthy elite patrons standing in a tight voyeuristic circle collectively held their breath, eagerly anticipating Maya's frantic emotional reaction. They fully expected her to scream, to wildly throw her hands into the air, to engage in a loud, chaotic screaming match that would instantly validate their deeply entrenched stereotypes regarding lower-class behavior. The young legacy member, holding the smartphone up high, actively broadcasting the confrontation to tens of thousands of digital spectators, desperately adjusted his camera lens, attempting to capture the incoming explosion of drama. But the chaotic explosion never manifested. Maya Sterling deployed the absolute most terrifying weapon in her extensive corporate arsenal. She deployed total, absolute deadening silence. She did not flinch at Bradley's aggressive shouting. She did not turn her head to acknowledge his pathetic existence. She did not offer a single word of defensive explanation regarding her highly casual attire or her legitimate right to exist in the opulent space. She continued to look exclusively at her father, her hands resting gently but firmly on his shoulders. She reached up with her right hand and meticulously smoothed a minor invisible wrinkle on the lapel of Marcus' worn charcoal suit jacket. The physical gesture was so profoundly intimate, so completely unbothered by the screaming general manager, that it structurally devastated Bradley's psychological dominance. Maya was actively treating the supreme operational authority of the country club as if he were nothing more than a minor, annoying draft of cold air leaking through a poorly sealed window. The stark visual and behavioral contrast between the two primary figures was absolutely mesmerizing and highly destructive to the institutional hierarchy. Bradley Preston, dressed in a flawless midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo worth thousands of dollars, was completely losing his mind. He was vibrating with frantic, uncontrolled emotional energy, his face red and sweating, his voice cracking under the massive pressure of his own unchecked arrogance. He was a small, fragile man, desperately utilizing loud noises and aggressive threats to artificially inflate his perceived power. Maya Sterling, dressed in mud-splattered running shoes and a faded college sweatshirt, was a completely immovable, monolithic force of nature. She possessed the cold, terrifying gravitational density of a collapsing star. She required absolutely no external validation, no loud declarations of authority, and no aggressive physical posturing. Her power was completely absolute, intrinsic, and currently resting dormant just beneath the surface of her calm exterior. Bradley's profound inability to force Maya's compliance fundamentally broke his rational thought process. He could not comprehend a reality where his specialized corporate jargon and his tactical security guards failed to command immediate total submission. "Are you completely deaf?" Bradley shrieked, his professional hospitality facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. "I am the general manager of the Hawthorne Heritage Estate. I dictate who breathes the air in this lobby. Security, I gave you a direct operational order. Detain these two hostile trespassers immediately and forcefully escort them to the service exit. If they resist your physical apprehension, I want them thrown onto the wet concrete outside." The two massive private security operatives exchanged a highly uncertain tactical glance. They were hired specifically for their intimidating physical mass and their willingness to deploy violence, but they were also highly trained to subconsciously read power dynamics. Every instinct in their tactical training screamed that the young woman standing in the faded streetwear was highly dangerous. There was a terrifying apex predator stillness in her posture that completely defied logical assessment. However, the aggressive screaming directives from the general manager ultimately forced their hand. The operative on the right took a heavy, hesitant step forward, reaching his large hand out toward Maya's shoulder, intending to execute a standard physical compliance hold. Maya finally moved. She did not retreat, and she did not raise her fists in a defensive posture. She simply shifted her physical weight slightly, placing her body entirely between the advancing tactical operative and her father. She slowly turned her head just enough to lock her sharp, calculating eyes directly onto the security guard. Her expression was completely blank, entirely devoid of fear, anger, or hesitation. It was the exact same cold, emotionless stare she utilized when completely liquidating the pensions of corrupt corporate board members. The tactical operative froze instantly, his heavy hand stopping dead in midair exactly 3 inches from the fabric of her sweatshirt. He felt an intense, visceral wave of primal terror wash over his entire nervous system. He fundamentally understood in that exact fraction of a second that if his fingers made physical contact with this woman, his entire life would be violently and permanently dismantled. The heavy antique mahogany grandfather clock standing majestically in the center of the grand lobby chimed a deep, resonant note, signaling the passing of another minute. The temporal pressure was actively crushing the oxygen out of the room. It was exactly 6:53 in the evening. There were exactly 7 minutes remaining until the highly anticipated philanthropic reveal in the adjacent grand ballroom. 7 minutes until the desperate board of directors expected to meet the anonymous billionaire savior who held the absolute financial fate of their prestigious institution in her hands. Bradley Preston remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial apocalypse actively standing in his lobby. He was entirely consumed by his pathetic, desperate need to win a petty localized power struggle against an elderly black man and his daughter. Maya slowly and deliberately broke eye contact with the paralyzed security operative, fundamentally dismissing his physical threat as entirely irrelevant. She turned her attention back to Marcus, completely ignoring the frantic, screaming general manager and the highly toxic wealthy bystanders. She spoke to her father in a quiet, conversational tone that carried effortlessly through the cavernous, silent lobby. Dad, Maya said, her voice projecting absolute ironclad certainty. I want you to know that you look incredibly handsome tonight. That suit has always been my absolute favorite. It carries the profound history of everything you sacrificed to build our family. There is absolutely no piece of imported designer clothing in this entire building that commands the amount of genuine respect that you do right now. Marcus smiled, a deep, genuine expression of pure paternal love that completely eradicated the dark shadows of systemic humiliation. He stood taller, his broad shoulders squaring against the oppressive architecture of the country club. Maya had successfully shielded him from the psychological violence of the gatekeepers. She had meticulously restored his absolute dignity in front of the wealthy elite patrons and the tens of thousands of digital spectators watching the live broadcast. She had completely stripped Bradley Preston of his operational authority, utilizing nothing more than weaponized silence and an unbreakable familial bond. The containment phase of the conflict was officially complete. Maya had successfully secured her highly valued primary asset, her father. The defensive shield had held perfectly against the aggressive institutional assault. Now the tactical parameters of the engagement were about to violently shift. Maya Sterling was no longer operating in a defensive capacity. The apex corporate predator was actively transitioning into her highly destructive offensive protocols. She was finally prepared to acknowledge the existence of the arrogant general manager currently hyperventilating behind his mahogany desk. But she would not acknowledge him as a human being worthy of basic respect. She would acknowledge him solely as a critical operational error that required immediate, devastating correction. The silence was about to break, and the ultimate manifestation of silent wealth was preparing to permanently rewrite the entire socioeconomic hierarchy of the room. The grand lobby of the Hawthorne Heritage Club plunged into an agonizing, suffocating silence that felt significantly heavier than the massive imported marble pillars supporting the towering vaulted ceilings. Maya Sterling had successfully established a flawless physical and psychological shield around her father, completely neutralizing the immediate tactical threat of the private security operatives. Now she seamlessly transitioned into the most devastating phase of her highly refined corporate conflict resolution strategy. She deployed her ultimate weapon against the deeply arrogant general manager currently hyperventilating behind the reception desk. She offered him absolutely nothing. She gave Bradley Preston no verbal validation, no aggressive emotional response, and absolutely no defensive explanation regarding her legitimate right to occupy that exclusive space. For a profoundly insecure man whose entire professional identity and fragile corporate ego relied completely on the immediate terrified compliance of his subordinates and the marginalized individuals he actively oppressed, this absolute void of attention was pure psychological torture. Bradley stood paralyzed behind his massive mahogany fortress, his face a horrifying real-time portrait of a man entirely losing his grip on his highly manufactured exclusionary reality. A thick, heavy bead of nervous perspiration broke through the expensive layer of designer cologne on his forehead, slowly rolling down his flushing cheek. He was breathing erratically, his chest heaving aggressively under his flawlessly tailored midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo, while he stared in complete disbelief at the back of Maya's faded gray sweatshirt. The wealthy white patrons forming the tight voyeuristic perimeter around the conflict zone were completely paralyzed by the sheer gravitational pull of Maya's calculated indifference. They had actively gathered in the center of the lobby to witness a chaotic lower-class spectacle, eagerly anticipating a loud, aggressive screaming match that would instantly validate their deeply entrenched racial prejudices. Instead, they were being forcefully subjected to a terrifying masterclass in apex corporate dominance. The digital livestream actively broadcasting the escalating conflict to the world experienced a massive, unprecedented surge in engagement. The global digital audience held its collective breath, watching a young black woman in mud-splattered running shoes completely dismantle a heavily guarded aristocratic sanctuary, using nothing more than the profound weight of her silent presence. Maya stood perfectly still, her flawless posture radiating the terrifying absolute calm of a predatory entity that had already mathematically secured the victory before the first blow was even officially struck. The temporal pressure in the opulent room was actively suffocating every single breathing person except her. The massive antique mahogany grandfather clock standing majestically in the shadows loudly ticked away the remaining precious seconds. It was rapidly approaching the absolute critical 7 o'clock deadline when the desperate, highly leveraged board of directors expected their anonymous billionaire savior to arrive in the adjacent grand ballroom to save them from catastrophic federal bankruptcy. Bradley was entirely oblivious to the monumental financial reality currently standing right in front of him. His highly fragile ego simply could not process the deafening silence. He desperately needed Maya to look at him, to acknowledge his supreme operational authority, and to submit to his racist hierarchy. He opened his mouth to shout another string of weaponized corporate jargon, but the pathetic words died completely in his throat as Maya finally initiated her signature physical movement. Moving with a slow, terrifying deliberation that completely commanded the absolute undivided attention of every single terrified person in the cavernous lobby, Maya gently raised her left arm. She did not raise it in a defensive posture or a threatening, aggressive motion. She simply bent her elbow and utilized her right hand to slowly push back the frayed elastic cuff of her oversized gray Howard University hooded sweatshirt. The cheap, faded cotton fabric slid slowly upward, revealing her dark skin. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the massive crystal chandeliers suspended high above the marble floor, a sudden blinding flash of brilliant light reflected violently off her wrist. It was absolutely not a cheap digital fitness tracker or a generic accessible fashion accessory. Secured tightly around her wrist was a breathtaking custom platinum Patek Philippe Nautilus. It was a flawless piece of master horology, an incredibly exclusive elite timepiece that strictly required decades of verified generational wealth and a highly restricted immaculate purchasing history just to be placed on the global waiting list. The complex mechanical dial featured a perpetual calendar and a highly sophisticated moon phase complication perfectly encased in heavy brushed platinum that easily retailed on the private market for over $250,000. The visual shockwave of that specific highly coveted luxury timepiece completely shattered the deeply entrenched socio-economic assumptions of the surrounding wealthy crowd. The elite patrons gasped collectively, their toxic aristocratic whispers dying instantly on their trembling lips. They recognized the iconic shape of the watch immediately. They fundamentally understood that a mechanical timepiece of that profound magnitude and absolute rarity could not possibly be faked, rented, or casually borrowed. It was the ultimate, undeniable physical manifestation of absolute silent wealth, functioning as a highly visible financial guillotine hovering directly over the general manager's neck. Bradley Preston stared directly at the heavy platinum watch and felt the warm blood completely drain from his flushing face, leaving him a sickening, terrifying shade of pale white. His highly prejudiced brain desperately attempted to reconcile the severe cognitive dissonance of a young black woman in casual athletic streetwear, casually wearing a proprietary asset that was worth significantly more than his entire annual executive compensation package. The heavy platinum luxury watch aggressively gleaming on his own shaking wrist suddenly felt incredibly cheap, heavily mass-produced and completely insignificant compared to the quiet, staggering dominance of her custom Patek Philippe. Maya stared down at the complex glowing dial of her watch for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. She was absolutely not simply checking the current time. She was highly purposefully demonstrating to every single person in the lobby that her personal time was the absolute most valuable financial commodity in the entire building, and Bradley Preston was currently wasting it. Having successfully established her unquestionable supreme financial supremacy without uttering a single audible syllable, Maya slowly reached her right hand into the deep front pocket of her faded sweatshirt. The 2 massive private security operatives standing mere feet away tensed their heavy tactical muscles, entirely unsure if they were legally supposed to initiate physical apprehension protocols against a woman casually wearing a $250,000 masterpiece on her wrist. Their extensive tactical training completely broke down under the crushing, devastating weight of her sudden, undeniable socioeconomic dominance. Maya smoothly withdrew her mobile device from her pocket. It was absolutely not a flashy, gold-plated consumer smartphone designed for social media consumption. It was a heavy matte, black, deeply encrypted corporate communication device utilizing a highly secure, decentralized private network specifically engineered for supreme executive officers handling highly sensitive multinational corporate acquisitions. She held the encrypted heavy device resting securely in the palm of her hand and slowly, deliberately unlocked the complex biometric security matrix utilizing her thumbprint. Her face remained a flawless, impenetrable mask of cold, calculating corporate precision. She did not look up at the sweating general manager as she began to type. Her thumb moved rapidly across the glowing digital keyboard with the terrifying rhythmic efficiency of a corporate executioner meticulously drafting an irreversible death warrant. She was actively initiating the final devastating stage of her hostile takeover protocols. She was directly messaging her elite legal counsel and her private equity executive management team, who were currently waiting silently in the secure armored vehicles parked just outside the country club gates. The specialized corporate terminology flowing rapidly from her fingertips was highly destructive and completely legally binding. She formally authorized the immediate aggressive liquidation of Bradley's restricted stock options and his accrued executive pension fund. She digitally triggered the specific ironclad legal clauses explicitly outlining gross professional misconduct and severe federal civil rights violations, automatically and officially terminating his lucrative employment contract with absolutely zero severance compensation. She explicitly commanded her aggressive corporate attorneys to immediately breach the main lobby entrance and physically flank the city mayor the exact moment she delivered the final verbal blow to the arrogant manager. The agonizing, suffocating silence in the grand lobby was finally violently broken by Bradley's complete psychological collapse. The general manager suddenly realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the invisible power dynamic in the room had violently inverted, and he was completely powerless to stop the incoming destruction. He aggressively slammed his manicured hands down onto the polished mahogany reception desk, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic, desperate scream. "Put that digital device away immediately!" Bradley shrieked, his perfectly curated professional hospitality facade entirely replaced by raw, primal, unadulterated panic. "You are actively utilizing an unauthorized recording device in a strictly confidential executive perimeter, which is a direct violation of our corporate bylaws. I am officially ordering you to surrender that encrypted phone to my tactical security staff right this very second, or I will personally have you aggressively prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the federal law." He was frantically babbling, utilizing entirely empty legal threats and specialized terminology to desperately mask his profound existential terror. The wealthy white bystanders who had previously actively supported his racist gatekeeping now physically backed away, rapidly distancing themselves from the rapidly sinking ship. The digital livestream metric completely exploded, surging past 50,000 active viewers as the global digital audience watched the incredibly arrogant manager completely unravel before a young woman who had still not spoken a single word to him. Maya completely ignored his frantic screaming and his pathetic physical posturing. She did not flinch when he violently slammed his shaking hands on the heavy desk. She simply methodically finished typing her highly complex legal directives. She reviewed the encrypted text message one final critical time, ensuring that every single corporate administrative parameter was perfectly aligned to maximize his absolute professional destruction and completely eliminate any potential legal loopholes. The heavy antique grandfather clock chimed a deep resonant note echoing through the chaotic lobby. It was exactly 6:55 in the evening. There were exactly 5 minutes remaining until the absolute violent collision of 2 entirely different socio-economic worlds. Maya slowly, deliberately pressed the glowing digital send icon resting on her high-resolution screen. The deeply encrypted data packet silently left her secure device soaring instantly through the local cellular network towers, carrying the absolute legal and financial authority to completely obliterate Bradley Preston's entire career, his social standing, and his financial future. The executive trap was formally and permanently sprung. The institutional guillotine was officially raised high into the air. Maya Sterling slowly lowered her encrypted black device, sliding it smoothly back into the pocket of her faded sweatshirt. She finally turned her cold apex predator eyes away from the floor and locked them directly onto the terrified, heavily sweating face of the arrogant general manager. The agonizing, suffocating silence was officially over. The devastating signature move was completely perfectly executed. The ultimate corporate execution was about to violently begin. The grand lobby of the Hawthorne Heritage Club plunged into an agonizing, suffocating silence that felt significantly heavier than the massive imported marble pillars supporting the towering vaulted ceilings. Maya Sterling had successfully established a flawless physical and psychological shield around her father, completely neutralizing the immediate tactical threat of the private security operatives. Now she seamlessly transitioned into the most devastating phase of her highly refined corporate conflict resolution strategy. She lowered her heavily encrypted corporate communication device and slid it smoothly back into the front pocket of her faded gray hooded sweatshirt. She shifted her physical stance slightly, turning her athletic frame away from her father and directing her absolute, undivided attention toward the massive mahogany reception desk. She locked her cold, highly analytical eyes directly onto Bradley Preston. The general manager was currently gripping the edges of his polished desk so tightly that his manicured knuckles had turned completely white. His breathing was shallow and erratic, his chest heaving under his incredibly expensive midnight blue tuxedo. He was a man actively drowning in his own manufactured authority, desperately waiting for a life raft that was never going to arrive. When Maya finally spoke, her voice did not echo with the frantic, uncontrolled emotional volume that Bradley had been utilizing. Her tone was incredibly soft, perfectly modulated, and terrifyingly polite. It was the highly practiced, deeply resonant voice of an apex corporate predator who completely controlled the boardroom. It was a voice that did not need to shout to demand absolute compliance. "I understand you are the current general manager operating this specific facility," Maya said. Her words sliced through the heavy perfumed air with the precise surgical lethality of a scalpel. "You have been projecting your voice quite loudly across this lobby, so I will assume your name is Bradley Preston. Is that correct?" The sheer polite professionalism of her inquiry completely short-circuited Bradley's aggressive defensive posture. He was entirely prepared for a chaotic screaming match, a violent verbal altercation that would allow him to deploy his private security operatives and forcefully eject her from the premises. He was absolutely not prepared for a calm clinical performance review conducted by a woman wearing mud-splattered running shoes. "I am Bradley Preston, the Supreme Executive Operational Authority of the Hawthorne Heritage Estate." He stammered, his voice cracking slightly before he aggressively cleared his throat to artificially deepen his pitch. "And you are currently trespassing in a highly restricted zone. I do not care what kind of coordinated fraudulent scam you and this old man are attempting to execute tonight. You have exactly zero administrative clearance to be standing on this marble floor." Maya simply looked at him, her face a flawless, impenetrable mask of absolute calm. The wealthy white patrons standing in the voyeuristic circle collectively leaned in closer, completely captivated by the devastating psychological warfare actively unfolding before them. The digital livestream metric continued its massive exponential surge, pushing past 60,000 active global viewers. "I appreciate your deep, passionate commitment to maintaining your perimeter security," Bradley Maya replied, her voice dripping with a highly toxic, weaponized politeness. "However, your operational execution is fundamentally flawed, and your administrative methodology is a catastrophic liability to this institution. You are currently operating under the deeply mistaken assumption that your physical proximity to generational wealth somehow magically grants you actual executive power. It does not. You are simply a mid-level hospitality employee wearing a rented tuxedo." The absolute factual brutality of her statement, delivered with such a gentle conversational cadence, struck Bradley like a physical blow to the chest. The wealthy bystanders gasped audibly, completely shocked by the surgical precision of her insult. Bradley's face instantly flushed a dark, violent shade of crimson, his fragile corporate ego completely fractured under the immense crushing weight of her socio-economic diagnosis. Instead of recognizing the severe structural danger he was currently in, his unchecked arrogance forced him to aggressively double down. He actively chose to dig his own professional grave significantly deeper. "You listen to me, you arrogant piece of street trash!" Bradley hissed, his professional hospitality facade completely dissolving into raw, unfiltered racial and classist hostility. I hold a master degree in luxury hospitality management. I personally dictate the operational matrix for the most exclusive legacy membership in this entire state. I deny entry to millionaire real estate developers and highly successful corporate attorneys on a weekly basis because they do not meet my strict cultural fit algorithms. Do you honestly believe I'm going to stand here and accept a performance evaluation from a deeply confused woman wearing a cheap college sweatshirt and dirty athletic shoes? Bradley pointed a shaking, violently aggressive finger directly at Marcus, who was standing quietly and proudly right behind his daughter. That man is a blatant demographic anomaly in this environment, Bradley shouted, his voice echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings. He attempted to breach my security perimeter, utilizing a poorly fabricated gold-foiled executive invitation, a Tier 1 executive access credential. Do you comprehend how entirely statistically impossible it is for an individual of his socioeconomic background to legitimately possess that proprietary asset? It is an insult to my intelligence and a direct threat to the institutional integrity of my lobby. Maya did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt his frantic, unhinged monologue. She simply allowed him to fully publicly expose his deeply entrenched systemic biases to the massive global audience watching the live broadcast. She was actively gathering highly actionable verbal evidence of his gross professional misconduct. Your reliance on discriminatory statistical probabilities to justify your blatant racial profiling is a severe violation of the Federal Civil Rights Act, Bradley Maya stated calmly, her voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of a Supreme Court justice delivering a final verdict. You did not even attempt to verify his biometric credentials or scan the digital encryption matrix printed on his invitation. You simply looked at the color of his skin and the fabric of his suit, and you aggressively executed a deeply prejudiced assumption. That is not luxury hospitality management, Bradley. That is gross administrative negligence fueled by an incredibly pathetic personal insecurity. Bradley's jaw dropped open in absolute shock. He was completely paralyzed by her flawless utilization of specialized legal and corporate terminology. He could not fundamentally comprehend how a woman dressed in such casual, unstructured attire possessed such an incredibly high level of executive vocabulary and total psychological dominance. He desperately looked around the grand lobby, seeking any form of validation from the wealthy elite patrons who had previously supported his exclusionary gatekeeping. But the elite crowd was completely silent, actively backing away from the reception desk. They recognized a sinking ship, and they absolutely refused to go down with a failing middle manager. The massive antique mahogany grandfather clock chimed again. It was exactly 6:57 in the evening. There were exactly 3 minutes remaining until the highly anticipated philanthropic reveal in the adjacent grand ballroom. The temporal pressure was actively crushing the remaining oxygen out of the physical space. Bradley Preston heard the heavy ticking of the clock, and he suddenly found his absolute final desperate lifeline. He clung to the impending corporate schedule, utilizing it as his ultimate weapon of intimidation. You have absolutely no idea what is currently happening inside this building. Bradley laughed, a sharp, cruel, unhinged sound that echoed terribly through the quiet room. We are currently 3 minutes away from the absolute most critical executive presentation in the modern history of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. The city mayor is currently standing right behind those double doors reviewing his keynote address. The entire local political machine and the regional financial elite are actively gathered in my ballroom. And most importantly, we are about to publicly unveil the identity of our anonymous mega donor, the visionary billionaire savior who recently acquired a vast majority stake in our parent corporation. Bradley puffed out his chest, his toxic arrogance temporarily returning as he invoked the power of the unseen billionaire owner. He was actively boasting about the supreme financial authority of the new corporate overlord, completely, entirely unaware that he was aggressively shouting directly into the incredibly calm face of that exact same billionaire. When that new owner walks through those doors, Bradley continued, his voice dripping with venomous, triumphant certainty. They are going to expect a flawlessly executed environment. They are going to expect absolute operational perfection. They are not going to tolerate the visual pollution of lower-class trespassers disrupting their multi-million-dollar philanthropic reveal. I am actively protecting the fiduciary interests of a private equity billionaire, and I will absolutely not allow you to compromise my highly lucrative career. Maya tilted her head slightly, a deeply terrifying, perfectly polite smile slowly forming on her lips. It was the exact smile of an apex predator watching its prey completely sever its own vital arteries. I find your sudden profound dedication to protecting the fiduciary interests of the new majority shareholder to be highly fascinating, Bradley. Maya replied, her voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every single corner of the silent lobby. Tell me exactly how do you personally believe this anonymous private equity billionaire will react when they discover that their newly acquired general manager has been actively utilizing state-sanctioned violence to publicly humiliate their invited VIP guests. Bradley slammed his fist down onto the polished mahogany desk, completely losing his final shred of rational control. I am absolutely done indulging your delusional corporate fantasies, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. I am completely finished, being verbally interrogated by trash. Security. I gave you a direct operational mandate. Execute a physical apprehension immediately. Restrain this woman and her father. If they resist, you are fully authorized to utilize heavy physical compliance techniques. I want them both violently dragged out the front doors and thrown onto the freezing concrete. Call the chief of police right now and tell him I want 2 immediate arrests for severe criminal trespassing and fraudulent solicitation. The 2 massive private security operatives who had been completely paralyzed by Maya's overwhelming silent authority suddenly snapped back to reality. The direct aggressive screaming orders from their commanding manager combined with the immediate threat to their own employment forced them into a state of tactical physical action. They lowered their center of gravity, adopting highly aggressive combat postures, and began to advance rapidly toward Maya and Marcus. The digital live stream broadcasting the confrontation to the world completely exploded into absolute chaotic panic. Over 70,000 global viewers were frantically typing desperate messages, watching the aggressive security forces close in on the calm young woman and her elderly father. The physical tension in the opulent lobby reached a violent critical mass, stretching the psychological fabric of the room to its absolute breaking point. But Maya Sterling did not take a single step backward. She did not raise her hands to defend herself against the incoming physical assault. She simply stood her ground, her perfectly calibrated posture radiating the unbreakable monumental strength of a woman who held the entire corporate world in the palm of her hand. She maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with the hyperventilating general manager, allowing him to completely exhaust his pathetic aggressive tactics, allowing him to fully commit to his own professional execution. Bradley Preston stood tall behind his mahogany fortress, a sick, twisted smile of absolute victory stretching across his sweating face. He believed with every fiber of his deeply prejudiced being that he had finally successfully asserted his supreme dominance over the physical space. He believed he had won. He was entirely, totally, completely wrong. The polite guillotine had already been successfully triggered, and the devastating blade of absolute silent wealth was currently hurtling downward at terrifying speed, completely preparing to sever his entire arrogant existence from the corporate hierarchy. The 2 massive private security operatives closed the final remaining inches of physical distance between themselves and the dignified elderly man, their heavily muscled arms raised, preparing to execute a brutal physical compliance maneuver that would forcefully drive Marcus Sterling down onto the cold, imported Italian marble floor. Bradley Preston leaned far over his polished mahogany reception desk, his expensive midnight blue tuxedo jacket pulling tightly against his shoulders. A sickeningly triumphant smirk dominated his flushed face, completely intoxicated by his own manufactured corporate authority. He was exactly 1 second away from witnessing the violent physical expulsion of the socio-economic anomaly he so deeply despised. The heavy antique mahogany grandfather clock finally struck the absolute critical hour. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. Before the heavy brass pendulum could strike its second resounding chime, the massive front entrance doors of the Hawthorne Heritage Club violently burst apart. The heavy polished brass doors were forcefully shoved outward with immense physical momentum, slamming aggressively against the interior stone walls and creating a deafening crash that completely shattered the suffocating tension in the grand lobby. A violent howling gust of freezing winter wind instantly invaded the heavily perfumed air, bringing with it the harsh, chaotic reality of the outside world. The 2 tactical security operatives immediately froze, their heavy hands hovering mere millimeters from Marcus' jacket, instinctively reacting to the sudden explosive breach. Stepping through the grand threshold was not the local municipal police force that Bradley had arrogantly requested. It was an overwhelming phalanx of absolute, undeniable institutional power. Leading the vanguard was the mayor of the city, a deeply influential political titan, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal overcoat. He was immediately flanked by a highly synchronized team of 6 elite corporate attorneys from the most ruthless litigation firm in the state. These men and women wore flawless, bespoke suits and carried heavy leather briefcases containing highly classified executive restructuring documents. They moved with the terrifying synchronized precision of a military strike force, stepping onto the marble floor with a heavy, unified cadence commanding the absolute, undivided attention of every terrified person in the cavernous room. Bradley Preston experienced an instantaneous and violently nauseating psychological whiplash. The toxic, aggressive superiority that had fueled his racist gatekeeping completely evaporated from his bloodstream in a fraction of a second. He immediately recognized the mayor and the catastrophic political implications of having the city's highest elected official witness a physical altercation in his pristine lobby. Bradley frantically waved his shaking hands violently, signaling his confused security operatives to immediately stand down. His perfectly manicured face underwent a horrifying, real-time transformation, shifting rapidly from a mask of cruel, aggressive dominance to a pathetic, sickeningly sweet display of complete, sycophantic submissiveness. He frantically rushed out from behind his fortified mahogany fortress, his patent leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the imported marble. He completely abandoned his aggressive posture, instantly transitioning into the role of a deeply obedient corporate servant. He sprinted across the lobby, desperately smoothing the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo and stretching his face into a wide, desperate smile. "Mr. Mayor," Bradley loudly announced, his voice vibrating with a high-pitched, desperate eagerness, "we are incredibly profoundly honored by your early arrival this evening. Please accept my deepest personal apologies for the current chaotic state of the main entrance vestibule. We are actively neutralizing a highly minor security breach. I was just instructing my tactical team to forcefully clear out this unauthorized riffraff to ensure your highly anticipated keynote address proceeds with absolute operational perfection." Bradley eagerly extended his right hand, preparing to receive the validating handshake of the most powerful political figure in the region. He stood there smiling, completely confident that the mayor would validate his exclusionary actions. The mayor of the city did not even break his stride. He did not extend his hand to meet the general manager's desperate greeting. He looked at Bradley Preston with the exact same cold, dismissive expression one might reserve for a piece of unpleasant debris stuck to the bottom of a shoe. The mayor simply walked right past the trembling general manager, completely ignoring his existence. The elite team of corporate attorneys followed in a tight, synchronized formation, intentionally utilizing their physical presence to forcefully shoulder him aside. Bradley stumbled backward, his desperate, sycophantic smile freezing into a permanent mask of absolute, profound confusion. The political and legal vanguard marched directly toward the center of the conflict zone. The wealthy white patrons who had previously actively supported Bradley's racist gatekeeping completely scattered, frantically backing away to avoid being associated with the incoming corporate apocalypse. The mayor stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Maya Sterling. The stark visual contrast was absolutely staggering. The highest elected official in the metropolitan area was standing with his shoulders slightly bowed, projecting an aura of deep, deferential respect toward a young woman wearing mud-splattered running shoes and a faded gray hooded sweatshirt. The mayor slowly reached out both of his hands, not with the arrogant entitlement of a politician, but with the genuine, profound gratitude of a man whose entire legacy had just been salvaged from complete financial ruin. "Miss Sterling," the mayor said, his voice carrying a heavy, undeniable weight of absolute reverence. "We are incredibly profoundly honored to have you here this evening. Please accept my deepest, sincere apologies for any unacceptable delays you may have experienced at the front access desk." The digital livestream broadcasting this exact moment completely fractured the boundaries of the social media application. The viewer metric violently exploded past 85,000 active global participants. The global audience watched in sheer, unadulterated shock as the city mayor formally addressed the young woman in the casual streetwear, utilizing her surname with ultimate supreme respect. The internet rapidly connected the specialized corporate terminology with her highly recognizable identity. She was Maya Sterling, the ruthless private equity billionaire, the anonymous mega-donor, the apex corporate predator who now entirely owned the building they were standing in. Bradley Preston stood completely frozen behind the wall of corporate attorneys, his heart violently hammering against his ribs. His fragile, exclusionary universe was rapidly collapsing in on itself. The supreme operational authority he had so aggressively weaponized against an innocent elderly man had just been completely invalidated by the highest political power in the state. He stared at the faded gray fabric of Maya's hooded sweatshirt, finally comprehending the devastating apocalyptic magnitude of the horrific professional mistake he had just committed. The polite guillotine had officially dropped, and his corporate execution was currently entirely underway. The mayor of the city respectfully stepped backward, completely yielding the absolute center of the grand lobby to Maya Sterling. The 6 elite corporate attorneys immediately fanned out behind her, forming an impenetrable human wall of bespoke suits and heavy leather briefcases. The visual hierarchy of the room had just violently inverted. The absolute ultimate power dynamic had been permanently restructured in a matter of seconds. Bradley Preston was completely paralyzed. His incredibly expensive midnight blue tuxedo suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket, pulling tightly across his chest and restricting his breathing. The oxygen in the heavily perfumed lobby seemed to instantly evaporate, leaving him gasping for air as his fragile, exclusionary corporate reality completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stared in absolute horrific disbelief at the young black woman standing before him in mud-splattered running shoes and a faded gray hooded sweatshirt. His highly prejudiced brain desperately scrambled to process the catastrophic information that the supreme political authority of the city had just bowed to a woman he had actively labeled as street trash. Maya Sterling did not grant the arrogant general manager a single moment to mentally recover from the political shockwave. She shifted her physical stance slightly, squaring her athletic shoulders and locking her dark, sharp eyes directly onto Bradley's sweating face. She looked at him with the cold, terrifying, absolute zero temperature of an apex corporate predator who had already mathematically secured the victory. She did not raise her voice. She did not exhibit a single trace of the frantic, emotional energy that Bradley had been violently projecting. She simply delivered the devastating financial facts with the precise surgical lethality of a master executioner bringing down the blade. Bradley Preston, Maya began, her voice perfectly modulated and carrying effortlessly through the cavernous, silent lobby. The sound of her voice commanded absolute unconditional obedience from every single terrified person in the room. As of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, Eastern Standard Time, my private equity management firm Sterling Holdings formally executed a highly aggressive hostile takeover of the Hawthorne Heritage Parent Corporation. The wealthy white patrons who had previously actively supported Bradley's racist gatekeeping collectively gasped their toxic aristocratic whispers, completely silenced by the sheer magnitude of the corporate revelation. The digital livestream broadcasting the confrontation to the world completely exploded, surging past 90,000 active global viewers as the internet collectively witnessed the ultimate manifestation of silent wealth. Maya took one slow, deliberate step forward, her running shoes making absolutely no sound against the imported Italian marble floor. We systematically acquired your heavily defaulted commercial real estate loans and your entirely toxic debt assets through a highly complex network of decentralized offshore shell companies. She continued her specialized corporate terminology, completely paralyzing the general manager. Upon securing the primary debt obligations, we immediately forced an emergency shareholder vote and successfully acquired a 78% majority controlling stake in this specific legacy institution. The total finalized transaction required exactly $412 million in liquid cash. The massive, staggering financial number echoed terribly against the vaulted ceilings, striking Bradley with the devastating physical force of a speeding freight train. He actually stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the cold marble floor. He desperately reached out a shaking, manicured hand to blindly grip the edge of his polished mahogany reception desk, simply to keep his trembling knees from completely collapsing beneath his own weight. I am the anonymous philanthropic mega donor. Your desperate, highly leveraged board of directors has been frantically waiting to meet tonight, Maya stated, her voice projecting an unbreakable monolithic authority. I am the sole financial savior of this fundamentally mismanaged and heavily prejudiced establishment. I own the incredibly expensive marble floor you are currently standing on. I own the crystal chandeliers hanging above your head. And as of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, I am officially your new supreme executive boss. Bradley Preston was actively experiencing a massive, catastrophic psychological failure. His perfectly curated professional hospitality facade completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but raw, primal, unadulterated terror. He looked at the incredibly calm face of the young black woman and finally fundamentally understood the apocalyptic magnitude of his horrific professional mistake. He had not merely insulted a wealthy guest. He had actively utilized state-sanctioned violence to publicly humiliate the beloved father of the multi-billionaire who now completely owned his entire miserable existence. Maya did not stop. The financial revelation was merely the first phase of her highly destructive conflict resolution strategy. She immediately transitioned into the highly precise legal execution, utilizing the English language as an inescapable ironclad trap. Under the explicit contractual stipulations, clearly outlined within Section 8, Clause 4 of your standardized executive employment agreement, Maya declared, her words slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. Any documented instances of gross professional misconduct are grounds for immediate administrative review. Furthermore, your highly aggressive physical and verbal actions tonight constitute severe documented violations of the Federal Civil Rights Act. The 6 elite corporate attorneys standing in the synchronized formation behind Maya simultaneously opened their heavy leather briefcases. They retrieved thick stacks of highly classified executive restructuring documents and official legal termination notices, completely validating her verbal declarations with an overwhelming display of absolute legal preparation. You actively engaged in blatant, undeniable racial profiling. Maya continued meticulously listing his corporate crimes for the massive global audience watching the live broadcast. You publicly harassed a verified executive VIP guest. You willfully ignored standard biometric security protocols, entirely relying on your deeply entrenched systemic biases to aggressively evaluate a human being. And most egregiously, you authorized your private tactical security operatives to utilize unwarranted physical force against an elderly man simply because he did not visually align with your highly toxic exclusionary algorithms. Bradley opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a desperate, pathetic defense, but absolutely no sound emerged from his trembling lips. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the crushing, undeniable weight of his own documented racism. These specific and highly public contractual breaches do not merely require a standard administrative disciplinary action. Maya stated, her voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous register that absolutely terrified every single wealthy bystander in the room. They strictly mandate an absolute, immediate, and entirely uncompensated termination of your employment contract. You are officially fired, Bradley, effective immediately upon this verbal declaration. The polite guillotine finally struck the execution block, completely severing Bradley's professional life from the corporate hierarchy. But Maya Sterling was an apex predator who believed in absolute total destruction of corrupt assets. She was absolutely not finished dismantling his fragile, exclusionary reality. Your unvested corporate stock options are fully liquidated and permanently voided. Maya commanded, her legal jargon completely erasing his entire financial future. Your accrued executive pension fund is completely frozen, pending a highly comprehensive external federal audit of your discriminatory management practices and potential financial embezzlement. You no longer possess any operational authority, any administrative clearance, or any basic legal right to stand inside my building. Bradley Preston was completely spiritually and professionally broken. The loud, arrogant gatekeeper who had just spent the last 20 minutes terrorizing Marcus Sterling had been entirely violently erased from the universe. He looked down at the torn pieces of the heavy gold-foiled VIP invitation, still resting on the marble floor right next to Marcus' worn leather shoes. That shredded piece of proprietary cardstock was the exact catalyst of his absolute destruction. Mr. Preston, one of the lead corporate attorneys, suddenly spoke, stepping forward from the synchronized formation. The attorney possessed a cold, completely emotionless voice that perfectly complemented Maya's absolute zero-temperature rage. My legal team has already officially notified the local municipal authorities regarding your severe violations of the Federal Civil Rights Act. However, before the police arrive to formally process your discriminatory actions, you are legally required to immediately surrender your corporate security access keys and your administrative digital devices. The terrifying reality of federal legal prosecution completely shattered the final remaining fragments of Bradley's sanity. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life aggressively hiding behind the massive stone walls of the Hawthorne Heritage Club, utilizing his corporate title as an impenetrable shield to terrorize marginalized individuals. Now that highly fortified shield had been violently ripped away, leaving him completely exposed, completely powerless, and entirely ruined. He slowly raised his shaking hands, reaching into the pockets of his incredibly expensive midnight blue tuxedo. He pulled out a heavy ring of brass master keys and a highly advanced digital security matrix tablet. He placed them slowly and pathetically onto the surface of the mahogany desk, his hands trembling so violently that the brass keys rattled loudly against the polished wood. Maya Sterling stood perfectly still, watching the complete destruction of the arrogant general manager with absolute emotionless satisfaction. She had successfully utilized her ultimate power, entirely turning the tables on the highly prejudiced antagonist and securing absolute justice for her father. The massive global audience watching the digital live stream completely erupted into a chaotic frenzy of absolute triumphant celebration. The viewers typed frantic messages praising the flawless execution of the silent wealth strategy, entirely captivated by the breathtaking display of absolute corporate dominance. The suffocating racial tension that had previously poisoned the grand lobby was completely eradicated, entirely replaced by the clean, cold, refreshing air of absolute, undeniable systemic justice. The heavy ring of brass master keys and the highly advanced digital security matrix tablet sat on the polished mahogany desk, functioning as the physical tombstone of Bradley Preston's entire career. The absolute finality of his corporate execution hung heavily in the air, suffocating his lungs and completely shattering his highly manufactured aristocratic facade. He was no longer the supreme operational authority of the Hawthorne Heritage Club. He was instantly reduced to an unemployed, heavily leveraged middle manager facing severe federal prosecution. His perfectly tailored midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo, which just moments ago functioned as his impenetrable armor of exclusionary privilege, now looked pathetic and deeply absurd, hanging loosely on his trembling frame. He looked up from the mahogany desk and stared directly into the cold, analytical eyes of Maya Sterling. He desperately searched her flawless expression for even a microscopic fraction of basic human empathy or professional hesitation. He found absolutely nothing. He was looking directly into the terrifying absolute zero-temperature void of an apex corporate predator who had completely neutralized a highly toxic asset. The stark visual and psychological contrast between the two individuals was absolutely staggering. Maya stood perfectly still, her athletic posture radiating the unbreakable monumental strength of a woman who completely controlled a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. She did not need to raise her voice or puff out her chest, because her supreme authority was woven directly into the fundamental fabric of reality. Bradley, on the other hand, was physically crumbling, rapidly degenerating into a frantic, desperate puddle of raw primal panic. The massive global audience watching the digital livestream completely held their breath, actively witnessing the complete psychological destruction of the arrogant gatekeeper. Bradley fell heavily to his knees. The sudden, violent physical movement sent a loud, echoing thud across the imported Italian marble floor. The wealthy white patrons who were still lingering on the extreme periphery of the lobby collectively gasped in absolute horror, completely scandalized by the total evaporation of his personal dignity. Bradley did not care about the wealthy bystanders anymore. He did not care about the city mayor or the elite corporate attorneys standing in a synchronized formation behind Maya. He only cared about his own immediate financial survival. He reached his shaking, manicured hands out toward the hem of Maya's faded gray hooded sweatshirt, his voice completely shattering into a high-pitched, wet sob. "Ms. Sterling, please, I am begging you!" Bradley cried, his perfect aristocratic diction entirely replaced by the frantic babbling of a terrified man. "You absolutely cannot liquidate my unvested corporate stock options. You cannot freeze my executive pension fund. I have a massive primary mortgage on my residential property, and the adjustable interest rate is completely destroying my personal equity. I have a young daughter currently enrolled in an incredibly expensive elite private academy. If you permanently void my financial compensation package, I will lose absolutely everything. I will be completely bankrupt by the end of the fiscal quarter." He was aggressively utilizing his own family and his personal financial liabilities as a desperate defensive shield, entirely hoping to emotionally manipulate the billionaire into reversing her ironclad legal directive. He continued to weep loudly, his expensive designer cologne mixing with the sharp, acrid scent of his own nervous sweat. "I was simply attempting to rigorously enforce the strict operational bylaws of the institution," Bradley stammered, his desperate mind actively searching for any possible corporate justification. "I was just following standard security protocols to ensure the absolute safety of the legacy membership. It was just a minor administrative mistake. Please, Ms. Sterling, you must show some professional leniency. I am a dedicated father. I was just trying to protect the club." Maya Sterling did not take a single step backward to avoid his grasping hands. She stood completely rooted to the marble floor, looking down at the weeping, broken man with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. She did not feel a single ounce of professional leniency or personal sympathy. She simply saw the profound, sickening hypocrisy of a systemic oppressor aggressively demanding the exact same grace he had just violently denied her own family. "You are actively attempting to weaponize your status as a father to manipulate my administrative execution." Maya stated, her voice incredibly soft but carrying the devastating kinetic energy of a falling anvil. "You deliberately invoke the financial security of your daughter, while completely ignoring the undeniable fact that you just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively attempting to publicly humiliate and physically assault my father." Maya gestured gracefully toward Marcus, who was standing tall and proud, possessing the quiet, unbroken dignity that Bradley could never possibly comprehend. "My father spent 40 agonizing years performing grueling manual labor on the municipal transit system specifically so I could sit in the executive boardrooms that you desperately worship." Maya continued her specialized corporate terminology, completely dismantling his pathetic excuses. "He sacrificed his physical health to build the structural foundation of my entire financial empire. When you looked at his worn suit jacket, you did not see a dedicated father or a human being worthy of basic respect. You simply saw a demographic anomaly that violated your highly toxic, exclusionary algorithms. You aggressively denied him the fundamental right to exist in this space. So do not kneel on my marble floor and loudly demand my empathy. You absolutely exhausted your entire allocated supply of human compassion the exact moment you violently tore his executive invitation in half." Bradley sobbed uncontrollably, burying his flushed, sweating face into his shaking hands. The stark, undeniable truth of her corporate verdict completely crushed any remaining hope of a last-minute reprieve. "You claim you were simply following standard security protocols," Maya said, her voice completely devoid of any emotional warmth. "But your operational protocols are fundamentally rooted in deeply entrenched systemic racism. You did not make a minor administrative mistake, Bradley. You executed a highly deliberate weaponized assault against a marginalized citizen. The immediate liquidation of your financial assets and the total termination of your employment contract are not acts of personal vengeance. They are the strict, mathematically required corporate consequences of your own gross professional negligence. I am simply balancing the administrative ledger. Maya slowly turned her apex predator gaze away from the weeping man on the floor and locked her sharp, calculating eyes directly onto the two massive private security operatives. These were the exact same heavily muscled men who just minutes ago were actively preparing to forcefully drive her elderly father into the hard marble floor under Bradley's direct aggressive command. The two tactical operatives instantly stiffened, their heavy tactical boots snapping together as they stood at absolute rigid attention. They recognized the supreme ultimate authority in the room, and they were completely terrified of facing the exact same devastating financial and legal apocalypse that had just entirely ruined their former commanding manager. Maya looked at the security operatives and issued her final operational directive for the evening. You are currently contracted employees operating under the direct financial compensation of Sterling Holdings, she stated, her voice projecting a cold, undeniable executive mandate. I am officially authorizing a complete, immediate restructuring of your tactical priorities. The individual currently weeping on the floor no longer possesses any executive clearance, any administrative authority, or any legitimate right to occupy this highly secured perimeter. He is officially classified as a hostile, unauthorized trespasser. The two massive security operatives nodded in perfect synchronization, entirely eager to prove their absolute loyalty to the new billionaire owner and desperately hoping to secure their own continued employment. Maya pointed her finger directly at the heavy brass entrance doors leading out into the freezing, violent winter storm. Execute a physical apprehension immediately, Maya commanded, utilizing the exact same highly specialized corporate terminology that Bradley had previously weaponized against Marcus. Restrain the unauthorized individual and forcefully escort him off my private property. If he physically resists your tactical apprehension, you are fully authorized to leave him on the wet concrete outside until the local municipal police arrive to formally process his federal civil rights violations. The poetic justice of the administrative directive was absolutely devastating. The two heavily muscled security guards moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. They marched directly over to the weeping broken man, completely ignoring his frantic, desperate pleas for mercy. The guard on the left violently grabbed the shoulder of Bradley's highly expensive midnight blue tuxedo jacket, aggressively hauling the former general manager up from his knees. The guard on the right immediately seized Bradley's left bicep, applying a highly painful professional compliance hold that entirely immobilized the ruined executive. Bradley Preston shrieked, kicking his polished patent leather shoes against the marble floor as the massive guards began to forcefully drag his struggling body across the grand lobby. "No, please, you cannot do this to me," he screamed, his pathetic voice echoing terribly against the vaulted ceilings. "I am the general manager, I belong here." But his frantic screams were completely useless, entirely swallowed by the vast cavernous architecture of the exclusionary sanctuary he had once so proudly ruled. The wealthy white patrons actively turned their backs, completely refusing to make eye contact with the disgraced manager, permanently exiling him from their elite social matrix. The heavy antique mahogany grandfather clock finally struck 7 o'clock in the evening, its deep, resonant chime echoing throughout the entire estate. Exactly as the massive brass pendulum swung, the two tactical security operatives forcefully shoved the heavy main entrance doors open. A violent gust of freezing winter rain immediately whipped into the lobby. Without a single moment of hesitation, the guards aggressively hurled Bradley Preston completely out the doors and directly into the unforgiving, freezing storm. The heavy brass doors violently slammed shut behind him, permanently locking him outside in the dark, cold reality, completely severing him from the opulent world of extreme wealth and supreme privilege. Maya Sterling stood perfectly still in the center of the warm, beautifully illuminated lobby, having successfully restored absolute systemic justice to the room. The freezing wind was completely sealed away as the heavy brass entrance doors violently slammed shut, permanently exiling the arrogant general manager into the unforgiving winter storm. The grand lobby of the Hawthorne Heritage Club was left in a state of absolute breathless silence. The toxic, suffocating racial tension that had previously saturated the imported Italian marble walls was entirely eradicated, completely replaced by the undeniable monolithic presence of absolute corporate justice. Maya Sterling stood perfectly still, her breathing steady and calm, her apex predator protocols having successfully neutralized the immediate institutional threat. She slowly turned her attention back to her father. Marcus Sterling stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his dark, intelligent eyes shining with an overwhelming mixture of profound shock and immense paternal pride. He looked at his brilliant daughter wearing her faded gray Howard University hooded sweatshirt and mud-splattered running shoes, recognizing that she had just completely dismantled a racist corporate hierarchy without ever raising her voice. Maya gently reached out and took his calloused, scarred hand in hers, intertwining her fingers with his. She gave his hand a firm, reassuring squeeze, a silent physical promise that he would never again have to justify his fundamental right to exist in any room on this earth. The mayor of the city cleared his throat respectfully, breaking the profound silence. He gestured politely toward the towering double mahogany doors leading into the main grand ballroom. He addressed Maya, stating that the entire regional financial elite and the legacy board of directors were actively waiting inside, fully prepared for her keynote address and the official philanthropic reveal. Maya gave a single sharp nod. She did not request a single moment to change into her $50,000 custom silk couture gown waiting securely upstairs. She actively chose to enter the most exclusive aristocratic sanctuary in the state exactly as she was. She wanted every single wealthy patron inside that ballroom to look at her casual streetwear and fundamentally understand that their superficial aesthetic algorithms meant absolutely nothing in the face of true, absolute financial dominance. The heavy double mahogany doors were slowly pulled open by two terrified hospitality staff members. Maya and Marcus stepped through the grand threshold, flanked on all sides by the synchronized phalanx of elite corporate attorneys and the city mayor. The main grand ballroom was a breathtaking cathedral of generational wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring frescoed ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over hundreds of round banquet tables draped in imported European silk. The room was packed with the most powerful political titans, real estate moguls, and legacy trust fund beneficiaries in the metropolitan area. They were all wearing flawless, bespoke tuxedos and blinding diamond jewelry, sipping expensive champagne, and eagerly waiting to applaud the anonymous billionaire savior who had rescued their prestigious institution from catastrophic federal bankruptcy. As Maya Sterling confidently walked down the center aisle, the ambient noise in the massive ballroom began to rapidly die out, completely replaced by a rising tide of confused, toxic whispers. The wealthy elite patrons stared in absolute horrified disbelief at the young black woman in athletic leggings and a faded college sweatshirt, casually walking toward the grand stage. They instinctively judged her aesthetic appearance, completely failing to recognize the terrifying apex corporate authority radiating from her flawless posture. They assumed she was a lost utility worker, or a deeply confused trespasser who had somehow bypassed the lobby security perimeter. But their toxic whispers instantly mutated into stunned, paralyzing silence when they registered the city mayor and the highly recognizable elite litigation team actively escorting her with supreme deferential respect. The mayor stepped up to the polished lucite podium positioned in the center of the grand stage. He adjusted the microphone and looked out across the sea of confused aristocratic faces. He announced to the crowd that they were scheduled to formally introduce the anonymous philanthropic benefactor who recently secured the financial future of the Hawthorne Heritage Parent Corporation. He stated it was his profound absolute honor to present the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Holdings, the new majority shareholder and supreme operational authority of the estate, Maya Sterling. A collective shockwave of pure, unadulterated cognitive dissonance violently ripped through the grand ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy elite patrons physically recoiled, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic realization that their exclusive white sanctuary was now entirely legally owned by the young black woman standing on the stage in cheap running shoes. The digital livestream broadcasting the event directly from the lobby had already infected the smartphones of several younger attendees in the back of the room, and the viral truth of the brutal executive termination was actively spreading through the crowd like a digital wildfire. They were completely trapped in a socio-economic reality they fundamentally could not control. Maya Sterling slowly stepped up to the podium. She did not smile. She did not offer a warm, welcoming hospitality greeting. She looked out over the massive crowd with cold, calculating, analytical precision. She leaned into the microphone, her perfectly modulated voice, slicing through the heavy, terrified silence with the surgical lethality of a master corporate executioner. She announced that as of 9 o'clock that morning, her private equity management firm successfully acquired a 78% controlling stake in their legacy institution. She explicitly stated that she did not execute this $412 million hostile takeover to blindly preserve their highly toxic exclusionary traditions. She acquired the corporate asset to systematically dismantle its foundational architecture. She indicted the crowd, stating that for decades their institution had aggressively utilized vague cultural fit clauses, exorbitant financial initiation fees, and blatantly racist administrative algorithms to systematically reject highly qualified minority applicants. She declared that they had actively maintained a pristine public facade of progressive philanthropy while operating a heavily guarded fortress of generational segregation, and that their operational matrix was officially terminated. The crowd sat in absolute petrified silence, entirely incapable of challenging her ironclad legal authority. Maya declared she was officially initiating a complete systemic administrative overhaul. Effective immediately, she formally dissolved the Legacy Admissions Board and the Executive Membership Committee, permanently revoking their operational charters. She announced the implementation of a strict zero-tolerance corporate policy regarding racial profiling and discriminatory gatekeeping, backed by mandatory third-party federal audits. She issued a final, terrifying warning that any staff member or legacy patron found in violation of the Federal Civil Rights Act would be immediately permanently expelled from the property and aggressively subjected to maximum legal prosecution. Maya paused, allowing the devastating reality of the systemic restructuring to fully penetrate their fragile aristocratic egos. She continued, her voice softening slightly as she looked directly at her father sitting in the front row. She stated that true institutional justice requires significantly more than simply rewriting corrupt corporate bylaws. True justice requires actively building entirely new infrastructures for the communities they had historically marginalized. Therefore, she formally pledged a $50 million liquid cash endowment to completely redesign and structurally convert the entire exclusionary West Wing of the estate. She declared it would no longer serve as a private cigar lounge for trust fund beneficiaries. It was officially being converted into a state-of-the-art community center, a highly advanced technological incubator for Black youth, and a comprehensive wellness facility for local elders. The digital livestream, which had seamlessly transitioned into the ballroom via multiple smartphones, completely exploded into a massive global celebration. Hundreds of thousands of active viewers were typing frantic messages of absolute democratic triumph, watching a single brilliant woman utilize weaponized capitalism to completely destroy systemic racism. Maya let her voice swell with a deep, profound emotional resonance that completely filled the massive ballroom. She declared that this new foundational institution, this physical manifestation of systemic equality and absolute unyielding resilience, would not bear the name of any historical oppressor. It would officially and permanently be named the Marcus Sterling Wing. Marcus Sterling sat in his worn charcoal suit, completely overwhelmed by a massive surging wave of absolute vindication. Tears of pure, unadulterated pride silently rolled down his weathered cheeks. He looked up at his brilliant, powerful daughter standing on the grand stage, completely dominating the very room that had just attempted to violently reject his existence. He thought of the 40 agonizing years he spent scrubbing concrete transit platforms, the brutal double shifts, the aching arthritic joints, and the constant, relentless heavy weight of systemic humiliation. He had endured absolute hell simply to ensure his daughter could survive. And now she had not only survived, she had conquered the entire corporate world, and she had permanently carved his honorable name into the heavy stone foundations of their empire. The wealthy elite crowd, recognizing that they were entirely economically dependent on her absolute mercy, slowly began to stand up. One by one, they were forcefully compelled by the sheer gravitational pull of her silent wealth to offer a standing ovation. They clapped their hands, acknowledging the total, complete destruction of their racist hierarchy and the absolute triumphant victory of Marcus Sterling. The thunderous, forced applause of the defeated elite patrons slowly fades away, completely replaced by a quiet, profound stillness. The visual image of Maya Sterling stepping down from the grand stage to embrace her weeping, deeply proud father gently fades into a solid, impenetrable black screen. The chaotic noise of the corporate battlefield is entirely silenced, leaving only the incredibly intimate, deeply resonant voice of the narrator, speaking directly into the quiet space, bridging the digital divide to look directly into your soul. Have you ever stood completely paralyzed in the middle of a crowded room and watched someone you love with your entire being face the brutal, crushing weight of discrimination? Have you ever felt your heart physically shatter as an arrogant gatekeeper looked at your hard-working parents, the people who sacrificed their own dreams, their physical health, and their absolute comfort to build your future, and treated them as if they were entirely invisible? Have you ever felt that hot, desperate, helpless rage burning in your chest, wishing you possessed the absolute financial power, the ironclad legal authority, and the undeniable systemic influence to completely obliterate the prejudices standing right in front of you? You are absolutely not alone in that profound, silent struggle. The heavy burden of navigating a world that constantly demands you prove your basic right to exist is a trauma woven deeply into the fabric of our daily lives. But the incredible story of Marcus and Maya Sterling is a powerful, undeniable testament to the absolute truth that our quiet endurance is never meaningless. Every single grueling shift worked, every silent tear shed, and every dignified step taken in the face of blatant hostility actively builds the incredibly strong foundation for the next generation to step into their ultimate, undeniable power. We want to hear your incredibly powerful truth. We ask you to utilize the comment section below, not just as a digital interface, but as a sacred communal space to share your personal experiences. Share your profound stories of facing aggressive systemic bias. Share the beautiful quiet moments where your unwavering dignity completely shattered the fragile arrogance of ignorance. Share the names of the incredible elders who paved your path with their unrelenting sacrifice so we can actively honor their monumental legacy together. We rigorously read every single comment because your lived experiences fundamentally fuel our shared journey toward absolute equality. We ask you to please subscribe to our channel not merely to consume digital content, but to actively join a rapidly growing global movement, some moment of quiet courage. Subscribe to stand in total unbreakable solidarity with a community completely dedicated to exposing the deep systemic flaws of society and watching them be aggressively dismantled by the overwhelming, undeniable power of silent wealth. Subscribe to continuously witness the absolute most satisfying form of systemic karma, where the incredibly arrogant are legally stripped of their unearned privileges and the deeply marginalized are permanently elevated to their rightful thrones. Together, we will continue to highlight the brilliant strategic minds and the fiercely protective hearts that are actively utilizing massive corporate leverage to permanently rewrite the rules of the room. Join us because the incredible era of accepting quiet humiliation is officially permanently over, and the beautiful, devastating era of total systemic transformation has only just begun.